For a nation that prides itself on transparency, America sure knows how to keep a secret, especially when those secrets sleep in the same bed as power. Because the presidency isn't just a job, it's a myth machine, an illusionist box that transforms mortal men into marble busts and then quietly forgets the blood still drying behind the curtain. The office has seen glory, it's seen war, it's seen scandal, but most of all, it's seen silence. There are doors in that house that don't open anymore. Files that went missing before they were ever written. People who were erased, or erased themselves, or were maybe erased by something else. And so tonight, we wander the long, cold hallways of American memory. We dust off its sacred artifacts. We hold its legends up to the light and watch them cast a different kind of shadow. This isn't history class. This is After Hours. Welcome to 2 hours of unexplained mysteries about U.S. presidents. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Trust me, you're gonna want more of this kind of unsettling. Cue creaking rocking chair. A portrait of Taylor stares at us with eyes that don't blink. July 4th, 1850. President Zachary Taylor, hero of the Mexican-American War, had just finished celebrating Independence Day with a snack of cherries, iced milk, and a side of gastroenterological doom. 5 days later, he was dead. Official cause? Gastroenteritis. Colloquially, the summer complaint, but don't let the folksy euphemism fool you. This wasn't just a bad bellyache. His symptoms were sudden, violent, and persistent. Vomiting, intense cramping, delirium. Not exactly the exit you'd expect for a battle-hardened general. Rumors started almost immediately. The South had hated Taylor's stance against expanding slavery into new territories. He had openly threatened to hang anyone who tried to secede. And then, poof, he's gone. No hanging required. Some suspected arsenic. Others whispered about antimony, a toxin that mimics gastroenteritis. But there were no official investigations, no autopsies. Just a state funeral, a closed casket, and a very convenient silence. Flash forward to 1991. Enter Dr. Clara Rising, a former humanities professor turned historical investigator. She managed to convince Taylor's descendants to allow an exhumation. The body was dug up, bones tested, and results published. The verdict? Arsenic levels were elevated, but not fatally so. Case closed, right? Not exactly. Here's where it gets weird. The test results used neutron activation analysis, a controversial technique that can yield imprecise readings for arsenic due to contamination or post-mortem environmental exposure. Critics claimed the results were inconclusive. And here's the kicker. No other toxins were tested for. Not antimony, not mercury, not the other slow-acting 19th century favorites. Which means maybe he wasn't poisoned, or maybe the test just didn't catch the right poison. Or maybe, just maybe, someone wanted the illusion of certainty more than the burden of truth. Add to that, the political aftermath. Taylor's death elevated Millard Fillmore, a man far more sympathetic to Southern interests. Within a year, the Compromise of 1850 was signed, appeasing slave states and delaying the Civil War by a mere decade. History records Taylor's death as natural, but history also has a habit of doing what power wants it to. So here we are, with a stomachache, a fruit bowl, and a 5-day slide into the grave. Was it heat stroke? A case of 1850s bacteria? Or was it something colder? Sometimes a cherry is just a cherry. Other times it's the appetizer to treason. Sometimes the sea doesn't give things back. Sometimes it just waits for you to ask the wrong question. It begins not with the president, but with the ghost orbiting one. Aaron Burr, vice president, duelist, traitor, enigma, a man who shot Alexander Hamilton and then kept going, like history would eventually forgive him for it. But tonight's story isn't about the man who pulled the trigger. It's about the daughter he couldn't save. Her name was Theodosia Burr Alston, and on January 1st, 1813, she boarded a ship and vanished. She was 29, the daughter of a former vice president and political pariah, married to the governor of South Carolina, educated like a scholar, raised like royalty, and cherished by her father like a second chance at honor. She had boarded the schooner Patriot in Georgetown, South Carolina, en route to New York. The ship was fast, recently refitted, and privately owned. It was also lightly armed, a subtle nod to the threat of pirates and British warships still prowling the Atlantic during the War of 1812. Theodosia never arrived, and that's where the story should end. Just another maritime tragedy, the sea claiming another name, except it doesn't end, not even close. In the years that followed, dozens of accounts emerged. Confessions, sightings, alleged artifacts, a slow, fog-drenched mythology formed around Theodosia's disappearance, so thick and persistent that even now, over 200 years later, the case refuses to die. Some said pirates had captured the Patriot, looted the vessel, and forced Theodosia to walk the plank. Her final words, supposedly, "Tell my father I died bravely." Dramatic, but problematic. No confirmed pirate activity was documented in that region at the time, and pirates who murdered governors' daughters usually bragged about it. This story surfaced from an anonymous confession 50 years later. Others claimed the ship wrecked in a storm off Cape Hatteras, the infamous graveyard of the Atlantic. Plausible. There was in fact a storm in early January 1813, but no debris, no bodies, and no cargo ever washed ashore. Then there's the cursed painting. In 1869, a North Carolina physician claimed he had treated a dying woman years prior, an old, reclusive hermit who had once been given a portrait by a shipwrecked lady. That painting, he said, bore a striking resemblance to Theodosia Burr. The painting ended up in the hands of a collector. Experts debated its authenticity for decades. Was it a relic, a copy, a scam? No one could say, but the woman in the portrait had the eyes of someone who knew the ocean had secrets. Of course, some theories get darker. One version says Theodosia was captured by the British and secretly executed. Another claims she joined a remote religious colony under an assumed name. Still another insists that Aaron Burr himself arranged her disappearance because she knew too much about his failed Western Empire and alleged plots of treason. None of it proven, all of it possible. And here's the thing about Theodosia. Her disappearance is less about what happened to her and more about how the people left behind tried to rewrite her ending. Aaron Burr, upon hearing the news, was reportedly never the same. He stopped mentioning her in letters. He avoided public mourning, but when asked about her death, years later, he replied with the kind of haunted certainty only guilt or obsession could produce, "She is dead. She perished in the miserable little pilot boat in which she left Charleston." And yet, he never stopped watching the harbor. You can lose your head in a moment, but losing your brain takes an entire government. On November 22nd, 1963, at precisely 12:30 p.m., the motorcade slowed in Dealey Plaza, and America's innocence blew apart across the trunk of a 1961 Lincoln Continental. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in broad daylight, filmed by a tourist's shaky hands, and immortalized in 486 frames of grainy horror. What followed was chaos, a stunned nation, a stunned world, and a flurry of investigations that all arrived at the same pat answer. Lee Harvey Oswald did it, alone, with a bolt-action rifle, from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. And yet the case never really closed, because too many things didn't add up, and one thing in particular was just missing. The president's brain. Yes, missing, not metaphorically, literally. After the autopsy, conducted at Bethesda Naval Hospital under contentious, even hostile conditions, President Kennedy's brain was placed in a stainless steel container. It was labeled and stored in the National Archives. 3 years later, it was gone. Just gone. No log, no receipt, no security breach, no record of its removal. The brain of the 35th President of the United States disappeared from the U.S. government's most secure archive as casually as if someone had taken a lunch break and never came back. Officially, the Warren Commission never focused much on it. The disappearance wasn't even mentioned in the main report. When finally asked about it later, the National Archives shrugged. Nothing to see here. These things happen. Except they don't. We're not talking about a misfiled form or a stolen ashtray. We're talking about cranial tissue that could have proved or disproved multiple conflicting trajectories, wounds, and the number of bullets. The very evidence that could have answered whether the kill shot came from behind or the front, which if you've ever watched the Zapruder film, frame 313 in particular, you know is still up for debate. Some theorists suggest the brain was removed to hide how badly the autopsy was botched. Others believe it was stolen to prevent further forensic analysis that could challenge the lone gunman theory. And then there's the nuclear option. Robert F. Kennedy took it. That's right. Some claim RFK personally removed his brother's brain to conceal the extent of JFK's health problems, secret medications, or even undisclosed medical conditions that would have undermined the Camelot narrative. Because the Kennedy administration was an image, an illusion sculpted in marble and flashbulbs. The myth of American youth, vigor, virility, a dying president on steroids, amphetamines, and cortisone doesn't quite fit the vibe. No one ever proved this theory, but no one ever disproved it either. The container is still missing, the tissue is still gone, and with it, perhaps, the final proof of what happened in Dallas that day. So now, conspiracy theories rage on. The back to the lefters, the magic bullet believers, the triple shooter truthers, all fueled by one simple, absurd, devastating question. How do you misplace a brain? You don't. Not unless you meant to. Let's twist the dial back to 1972, a year of polyester suits, Cold War paranoia, and one of the strangest silences in presidential history. It wasn't the silence that was suspicious. It was how loud it was. Richard Nixon was many things. Paranoid, brilliant, vindictive, tragic, but above all, he was a man who wanted to be remembered on his terms, which is probably why he bugged himself. Yes, really. During his presidency, Nixon installed an elaborate voice-activated recording system in the White House. Every word, every grumble, every paranoid mumble muttered under his breath, it was all there, magnetized onto reel after reel of analog tape like a confessional booth wired for prosecution. And it was these tapes, these private recordings of public power, that would undo him. In the summer of 1972, 5 men were arrested, breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. It looked like petty political espionage, a smear job. Then the wiretaps were found, the hush money, the White House connections, and suddenly it wasn't petty anymore. Congress and the special prosecutor demanded Nixon's tapes. Nixon resisted. A battle ensued. The courts ruled, hand them over. Nixon reluctantly complied. But when investigators reached for the smoking gun, they found a void. 18 minutes and 30 seconds of erasure, right in the middle of a conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. Just 3 days after the break-in, a crucial window, gone. The official explanation? Nixon's personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, claimed she accidentally erased the tape. Her foot slipped on a pedal while she reached for the phone, keeping the machine running in record mode. She even demonstrated this in a now infamous photograph known as the Rosemary Stretch. One arm extended behind her, one foot on the pedal, the pose of a woman performing a kind of bureaucratic yoga. But here's the problem. The stretch might explain 5 minutes, not 18 and a half. Experts analyzed the tapes. There weren't just blank spaces, there were multiple erasure events. 7 separate segments. Deliberate, controlled, surgical. Theories bloomed like mold in a locked basement. Some claimed Nixon ordered the erasure himself. Others pointed to Haldeman or another aide. Some believed the tapes were tampered with after they left the White House, but no one ever confessed. No one was charged. No one could say what was said in that missing space. And here's the kicker. Nixon might have survived Watergate if not for the missing minutes. The erasure made him look guilty even before the rest of the evidence caught up. It was the silence that screamed. He resigned in 1974, pardoned by his successor, but the tapes? They live on, most of them, but 18 and a half minutes are still missing. Lost in static, swallowed by a hand too careful to be clumsy, and too clever to be caught. What was in that conversation? A direct order? A confession? A joke that aged like cyanide? We'll never know, and that's the point. In politics, silence isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's a strategy. Sometimes it's the loudest thing in the room. If every 20 years a president dies in office, at some point it's not a coincidence, it's a ritual. It starts with William Henry Harrison. The year was 1840. He was 67 years old, a former war hero and a marketing experiment in frontier machismo. His campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. a nostalgic reference to his 1811 victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe, where he led U.S. forces against a confederation of Native American tribes. Harrison won both the battle and the presidency, but he wouldn't get to enjoy either for long. On March 4th, 1841, during a cold and wet inauguration, he delivered the longest presidential speech in history. Over 8,000 words, no coat, no hat, just a man shouting destiny into the rain. 31 days later, he was dead. The official story, pneumonia. The real story, doesn't matter. He didn't just die. He started a pattern, because the next president elected in a year ending in 0, Abraham Lincoln, 1860, was shot in the head. Next up, James Garfield, elected 1880, shot, lingered in agony for months, died. Then William McKinley, 1900, shot by an anarchist at the Pan American Expo. Warren G. Harding, 1920, died suddenly of a heart attack, or maybe food poisoning, or maybe something more sinister. Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1940, re-elected during World War II, died of a cerebral hemorrhage in his 4th term. And then John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960. You already know how that one ends. Every 20 years, like clockwork, like a curse. The pattern was so clean, so eerie, that by the 1970s, the public had given it a name. The Curse of Tippecanoe, or for the Gothic crowd, the Curse of Tecumseh. You see, after the Battle of Tippecanoe, Native American leader Tenskwatawa, the prophet and brother of Tecumseh, was said to have declared that every great chief elected every 20 years would die in office. Harrison, they said, had awakened something ancient and unyielding, something not so easily buried under treaties and parades. Was it a coincidence? A statistical quirk? Sure, but tell that to the body count. Then came 1980. Ronald Reagan won the presidency. And in 1981, he was shot. A would-be assassin fired 6 bullets. One lodged in Reagan's lung, inches from his heart, and for a few tense days, everyone thought the curse had struck again. But Reagan survived. Then came George W. Bush, elected in 2000. No bullets, no assassination attempts, just 2 wars and a national nervous breakdown. By now, historians were rolling their eyes. See, curse broken, except curses don't break. They wait, they sleep. So maybe the curse isn't gone. Maybe it just doesn't need to kill the president anymore. Maybe it's changed form. Maybe it devours them slowly now. Eats at their legacies, their minds, their marriages. Maybe it takes the country down with them. Or maybe, just maybe, the real curse isn't supernatural at all. Maybe the curse is believing that anyone who wants this much power should be trusted with it. It wasn't a presidency. It was a weekend at Bernie's with global consequences. In October of 1919, President Woodrow Wilson vanished. Not from the public eye exactly, but from reality itself. He was halfway through his 2nd term, fresh off the trauma of World War I, and fighting tooth and nail to get the United States to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations. It was his dream, his legacy, his moral crusade. And then, quite literally, he collapsed. On October 2nd, in the White House, Wilson suffered a massive stroke. Not a minor wobble, not a bad day. A full-blown, brain-breaking, left-side, paralyzing medical event. He was bedridden. He was confused. He couldn't see out of one eye. His mouth drooped. His cognitive function, somewhere between compromised and catatonic. But here's the twist. Nobody told the public, not Congress, not the cabinet, not even Vice President Thomas Marshall, because someone else stepped in. Quietly, elegantly, ruthlessly. Her name was Edith Wilson, First Lady, devoted wife, and, depending on how you interpret the next 17 months, America's first female president. Officially, she just screened paperwork. Unofficially, she ghost-governed the United States. She decided which matters of state were important enough to bother the president with. She managed his schedule, reviewed briefings, and served as the gatekeeper between the executive branch and reality. She was, in her own words, simply stewarding the presidency, which is a very polite way of saying, the president was non-functional, and I was in charge. Let that settle in. The country was emerging from a world war. The Treaty of Versailles was hanging in the balance. The League of Nations was one vote away from birth, and the man elected to lead was lying in bed, drooling, while his wife played a very high-stakes game of national pretend. The cabinet knew something was wrong, but no one pushed hard enough. Vice President Marshall refused to invoke the 25th Amendment because it didn't exist yet. In fact, Wilson's condition was a major reason that amendment was written decades later. And still, no one did anything, because if the truth got out, it would collapse public faith. It would ignite a constitutional crisis. It might tank the treaty, so they played along. The press was fed scraps. A bout of exhaustion, a nervous strain, a touch of illness. Meanwhile, Wilson scribbled nonsense on documents, tried to sign with the wrong hand, and hallucinated White House staffers as French diplomats. When he did finally reappear months later, it was brief and rehearsed. But the truth never came fully to light until years after he left office. By then, the League of Nations had failed, America had turned inward, and Edith had rewritten the rules of proximity and power. So, was she a devoted spouse, a patriot, a constitutional saboteur, all of the above? The mystery isn't just what Wilson's condition was. It's how many people agreed to lie about it, how easily the office of the presidency slid into a coma, and how the world kept spinning anyway. No alarms, no revolt, no accountability, just a stroke and silence. Good, because now we're crossing from the realm of politics into the uninvited and undead. There's one resident of the White House who's never quite left, and he tends to show up when America is about to fall apart. Others leave footprints in the hallway. You can argue about Lincoln's politics, you can debate his motivations, but there's one thing no historian disputes. He died hard, and the country never really recovered. And maybe that's why he won't go. They say Lincoln haunts the White House. Not figuratively, not poetically, literally. It's been whispered for over a century, not by cranks or conspiracy theorists, but by world leaders, staffers, first ladies, even heads of state, all of them claiming to have seen, heard, or felt the brooding presence of the 16th president walking the halls of the executive mansion. It starts with Grace Coolidge, wife of President Calvin Coolidge, who claimed to have seen Lincoln standing at a window in the Oval Office, staring out over the Potomac, his back straight, his expression unreadable, silent, watching. Then came Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. In 1942, she was staying as a guest at the White House during World War II. One night, she was awakened by a knock at the door. She opened it and saw Lincoln standing there in full suit, stovepipe, hat, and all. She fainted on the spot. Winston Churchill, famous for not being easily rattled, claimed he had just finished a hot bath, cigar in hand, when he walked into the adjoining bedroom and saw Lincoln standing by the fireplace. The Prime Minister of Britain, naked as the day he was born, looked the ghost of emancipation in the face and said, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." Lincoln didn't reply. He vanished. The stories keep coming. Footsteps in the Lincoln bedroom, cold spots, the rustle of a coat, the deep sense that someone is just there, watching. Even Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the most grounded and rational first ladies in American history, claimed to feel his presence in the room where she worked. Her dog Fala would often bark at empty corners of the room. She said it was probably just nerves, but she stopped sleeping in that room anyway. And here's the thing. Lincoln's ghost doesn't appear during calm times. He shows up during war, crisis, collapse, the Great Depression, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Watergate, September 11th. It's almost as if the spirit of the man rises when the union he died to preserve starts cracking again. Is it grief that keeps him here? Guilt? Unfinished business? Or maybe Lincoln doesn't haunt the White House. Maybe the White House haunts Lincoln, a symbol too heavy to ever leave. A place where freedom has always been a work in progress, and the man who tried to finish the job still walks the halls, silently wondering where it all went wrong. Maybe he watches the current occupants and weeps. Maybe he's waiting for someone to get it right, or maybe he's just pacing, forever. History, as usual, just wanted her to shut up. Warren G. Harding was not a remarkable president. His administration was a carnival of corruption, most famously the Teapot Dome scandal, an oil lease fiasco that had more bribes than a poker game in hell. He died in office in 1923, possibly of a heart attack, possibly of food poisoning, possibly of something darker, depending on how far down the rabbit hole you're willing to crawl. But this mystery doesn't begin with death. It begins with love, or what looked like it. Her name was Nan Britton. She was 20 years younger than Harding. Blonde, idealistic, soft-spoken. In 1927, 4 years after Harding's death, she published a book called The President's Daughter. In it, she claimed that she and Harding had carried on a years-long affair, beginning when she was just a teenager, and that he was the father of her child, Elizabeth. The book was explosive, not just for the affair, but for the raw, intimate details. She wrote about hotel rooms, secret rendezvous, handwritten love notes, even alleged encounters in the White House closet. That's right. According to Nan, the President of the United States made love to her in a janitor's closet. Naturally, America reacted with grace, maturity, and understanding. Just kidding. They called her a whore, a liar, and a fame-chasing fantasist. Newspapers skewered her. Historians scoffed. Harding's supporters and family slammed the book as trashy fiction. The idea that a sitting president could carry on a passionate, years-long affair with a young woman and then abandon her and their illegitimate daughter was just too scandalous to be true. Or maybe it was just too inconvenient, because Nan never backed down. She kept insisting it was true. She even tried to secure financial support for her daughter from Harding's estate and was laughed out of court. But she had one thing no one could argue with: consistency. Her story never changed, and Elizabeth looked, well, a lot like Harding. Still, it wasn't enough. Not in a world where men in power didn't have to explain themselves, and women who said too much were always branded unstable. Decades passed. Nan died in 1991. Poor and ridiculed, never vindicated. Then, in 2015, science stepped in. Using DNA testing on descendants of Harding's legitimate family and Britton's lineage, researchers confirmed it. Warren G. Harding was, in fact, the father of Nan's daughter. Let that sink in. The book everyone mocked, the girl everyone shamed, it was all true. So, what do we make of this? Was Harding a romantic trapped by his station, or just another powerful man hiding his indiscretions behind the decorum of office? And what about Nan? Was she a tragic figure who tried to preserve the dignity of her child by telling the truth, or a warning that history only believes women when it can no longer be embarrassed by them? Because here's the kicker: Nan didn't want revenge. She wanted acknowledgement. She didn't ask for scandal. She asked for respect. And she got neither until she was dead. A nation's home without a cornerstone is like a sacred text with the first page torn out. You know something's missing, you just don't know what it said. September 13th, 1792. They gathered at the edge of what was then nothing, just a swampy patch of D.C., buzzing with mosquitoes and ambition. A crowd of masons, builders, politicians, and dignitaries looked on as the cornerstone of the White House was laid in place. There was fanfare, ritual, wine poured, tools presented, allegiance sworn. The Freemasons, because of course it was the Freemasons, performed the symbolic rites. The stone, heavy and dressed in marble, was said to represent the permanence and solemn authority of the new republic. And then it vanished. Somewhere between then and now, the White House cornerstone, the literal first block in the entire building, the ceremonial anchor of the executive mansion, disappeared from history. Today, no one knows exactly where it is. Not its location, not its orientation, not even if it still exists, which is weird. You don't just misplace a cornerstone. It's not a paperclip. It's a massive ceremonial block. And this one was allegedly inscribed and placed with pomp and formality. So what happened? One theory is almost insultingly mundane. During renovations, especially the Truman-era gutting of the White House in the 1940s, the original stone was accidentally removed, repurposed, or buried beneath new foundations. But here's the problem. No one reported seeing it. No one documented it. No pictures, no journal entries, no, hey look, it's the thing America was built on kind of moment. Which brings us to a more interesting theory. Maybe it was hidden or stolen. Some believe the Freemasons took it, that the stone, inscribed with esoteric symbols and possibly containing a time capsule of sorts, was removed deliberately and placed in an undisclosed location for safekeeping or secrecy. Others think it was buried deeper than anyone realized, covered by layers of reconstruction, misaligned by centuries of architectural shifts. Maybe it's still down there, a relic encased in concrete and forgotten plans. But of course, there's the darker angle. What if it never existed at all? What if the whole ceremony was theater, symbol over substance, a performance for legitimacy's sake? After all, America was still very much inventing itself in 1792. Maybe the Cornerstone was more myth than marble, a ghost of credibility dressed up in Freemason robes, or maybe someone didn't want it found. Because in Washington, a missing object is rarely just missing. It's reclassified, it's suppressed, it's absorbed into the blank spaces of official history, the places where plausible deniability and cultural amnesia overlap. And so, to this day, visitors walk through the White House having no idea what it stands on. No visible anchor, no ceremonial relic, just whispers and blueprints and questions. Which makes you wonder, what kind of country forgets its own first stone? And what happens when a house built on mystery starts to believe its own legend? Mystery number 10. The disappearance of the White House's first Steinway piano. Coming up next. Ready to dig into a presidential piano that vanished like a note swallowed by silence? Let's strike a chord with one of the classier disappearances in presidential lore. Because this next mystery isn't about war or scandal. It's about music, beauty, and the kind of quiet theft that doesn't feel like a crime until you realize what's missing. The disappearance of the White House's first Steinway piano. It was a gift to the nation. Now it's a ghost in the archive, if it even still exists. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt was gifted something extraordinary, a custom-made, one-of-a-kind Steinway piano. Not just any piano. This one was symbolic, regal, sculpted in mahogany and gilded in gold leaf, the legs carved into majestic American eagles. It was designed to be a national heirloom, a centerpiece of dignity, art, and soft power. A reminder that while America might be young, it could be cultured too. This wasn't your average concert hall instrument. This piano was American mythology set to 88 keys. It was installed in the East Room of the White House with great ceremony. It was played at state functions, photographed, adored, a musical monument in a house not exactly known for its subtlety. And then it disappeared. Today, that first Steinway is nowhere to be found. No public archive, no presidential library, no concert stage, no note from the Smithsonian saying on loan. It's just gone, not sold, not stored, not smashed into firewood, just vanished. How do you lose a 10-foot grand piano? Well, like all great presidential mysteries, there are theories. And like all great presidential mysteries, none of them are fully satisfying. One version says it was simply replaced. In 1938, Franklin D. Roosevelt received another Steinway, Steinway number 300,000, a sleeker, more modern Art Deco beauty with patriotic murals and bald eagles. That piano still lives in the East Room today, occasionally dusted off for visiting virtuosos and diplomatic charm offensives. So maybe the old one was retired, but retired to where? Some believe it was moved to a government warehouse, possibly in Maryland, possibly Virginia, possibly that giant Indiana Jones-style facility where the Ark of the Covenant now presumably collects dust. Others whisper that it was quietly sold off during renovations, its historic value overlooked in the chaos of modernization, a bureaucratic blunder that turned an artifact into anonymous auction fodder. And then there are the darker rumors, ones that feel more like ghost stories than explanations, that someone inside the administration spirited it away, that a donor borrowed it and never gave it back, that it was lost during wartime security shuffles or quietly destroyed during a fire or flood no one wanted to publicize. No official record confirms any of these, which of course only makes them feel more possible. Today, Steinway's own archives confirm the piano was delivered, displayed, and played, but no longer tracked. They don't know where it is, or if it still even exists. And that's the thing. This wasn't just an instrument. It was a statement that the White House could be more than war rooms and oil paintings, that it could echo with music. And now, it echoes with silence. Maybe it's in a private collection. Maybe it's covered in tarps and forgotten in a climate-controlled crypt. Or maybe it's been reduced to sawdust and memory. Either way, the message is the same. Even beauty can be lost in Power's house, especially when nobody's looking for it. The Unexplained Lights over the White House, 1952. Washington, D.C. was under siege. not by spies, not by tanks, but by something glowing, and not from this world. It was late July 1952. The Cold War was in full swing, the air thick with paranoia and secondhand smoke. Washington, D.C. was on edge. Nuclear threat, espionage, and McCarthyism were the soundtrack of the era. And then something appeared in the sky. Actually, 7 somethings, blips on a radar screen at Washington National Airport. The operators checked their equipment, then checked it again. But the blips weren't glitches. They were moving, fast, changing direction, hovering. Then they were spotted visually, bright, silent lights zipping over the Capitol building and the White House, darting across the night sky with impossible speed and agility. Not planes, not stars, not weather balloons, and not anything that belonged to us. Fighter jets were scrambled. By the time they arrived, the objects were gone. The press got wind of it the next day. Headlines screamed, "Saucers swarm over Capitol, jets chase UFOs over DC," and the Pentagon, suddenly very quiet. But it wasn't over. Exactly 1 week later, on July 26th, the lights came back. This time dozens of people saw them, commercial pilots, air traffic controllers, civilians on rooftops. Radar confirmed it. So did photographic evidence, although conveniently, none of it ever surfaced in official records. Once again, fighters were sent up. And, once again, the objects disappeared the moment the jets arrived. The Air Force blamed temperature inversions. Basically, hot air messing with radar signals. Case closed, except the radar operators, trained professionals, laughed that explanation off the runway. Temperature inversions don't make right-angle turns at Mach 2, and they sure as hell don't show up on multiple radar systems while pilots are visually tracking them in real time. And here's the thing. This wasn't just any city. This was Washington, D.C., the White House, the Pentagon, the National Mall. In other words, the most restricted airspace on Earth, breached twice by something that defied identification, interception, and gravity. President Truman was briefed. The CIA launched a secret investigation, Project Blue Book, in response to the rising tide of UFO sightings across America. But by the time their reports went public years later, the 1952 DC incident had been watered down into bureaucratic soup. Unexplained, but not alarming, which of course is exactly how you'd explain something very alarming, without actually explaining anything at all. So, what did they see? Advanced foreign tech, a top-secret US experiment gone rogue, or something not from any country or planet we know. Whatever it was, it came to the seat of American power. Twice, in 1 week. And we still don't have a name for it. Sometimes the most unsettling part of a mystery isn't the event itself. It's that the people in charge have no idea what it was either, and they never did. The missing papers of James Madison. When you write the blueprint for democracy, people are going to want to steal the drafts. James Madison was the guy who knew where all the constitutional bodies were buried, because he helped plant most of them. He was the 4th president of the United States, a political philosopher, the man behind the Bill of Rights, and the only U.S. president to have his capital city literally set on fire while he was in office. That's not poetic exaggeration. In 1814, during the War of 1812, British troops marched into Washington, D.C., met almost no resistance, and decided to burn the place down out of sheer colonial spite. They torched the Capitol, the Library of Congress, and, of course, the White House. Madison fled. His wife, Dolly Madison, famously saved George Washington's portrait before escaping, which was a good PR move. What wasn't saved, however, were boxes of presidential papers, crucial documents from the earliest days of the Republic, drafts of speeches, internal debates, private letters, possibly early discussions about the very structure of government. Some were official, some were personal. All of them are gone. And here's where it gets strange. No one knows exactly what went missing. That's the thing about historical records. You only notice the absence if you knew what was there to begin with. And no one, then or now, seems entirely sure what Madison had in his private files, which leaves a lot of room for speculation. Some historians argue that Madison may have been editing or even censoring his own legacy, that he had records of early constitutional compromises, secret deals, even correspondence with foreign agents, stuff he never wanted released. Others think the British took them, that troops ransacked the White House and made off with souvenirs, including potentially damning or politically valuable documents. If true, they've never turned up in any British archive. Not publicly, anyway. Then there's the possibility of destruction by negligence. Fire and looters scattered the city. Maybe the papers were left behind in the rush. Maybe they were deemed unimportant by someone who didn't realize they were holding irreplaceable history. Or maybe, just maybe, they were intentionally destroyed by Madison himself or by a loyal staffer. Someone who knew that the early days of American democracy were messier than the public was ready to know. Because Madison was many things, but naive wasn't one of them. He knew that ideals are fragile, that once you give the people a constitution, they start asking questions, like what was left out, and if you're trying to build a perfect union, the last thing you want is your first drafts leaking. So, what did we lose in those flames? A scandal, a secret compromise, an early version of the Constitution with more teeth, or more lies? We'll never know. All that's left is the image of a burning Capitol, and the sense that something important escaped the fire, but not the fog. The secret tunnels beneath the White House. For every official entrance to power, there's an unofficial exit, and in Washington, the real stories happen underground. The White House is a fortress, not in the medieval sense, no moat, no drawbridge, but in the modern one. Layers of security, bulletproof glass, a rooftop sniper team, and enough surveillance equipment to make Orwell blush. But the real secrets, they're underground. Everyone knows about the White House basement. Few talk about what's beneath the basement. There are tunnels. That much is fact, confirmed by blueprints, former staff, and the occasional disoriented contractor. Some are for emergency evacuation, some are for service staff, some no one talks about. One of the most famous, the tunnel between the White House and the Treasury Building, built in the 1930s during FDR's administration. It was a direct route for evacuation in case of attack. It's there. You can walk it if you know the right clearance code. But that's just the start. Rumors swirl of a labyrinth of passages connecting the White House to nearby government buildings, bunkers, and command centers. Some say there's a direct line to the Capitol. Others whisper of a deeper tunnel that leads to the Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, also known as Site R or the Underground Pentagon. How? Why? Because when you're president and the nukes start flying, you don't walk out the front door. You vanish through a hole in the ground and reappear somewhere no one can find you. But here's where the mystery takes a hard turn into the strange. During the Truman renovation of the White House in the late 1940s, when the entire interior was gutted and rebuilt, construction workers allegedly stumbled on extra tunnels. Unmapped, unplanned, not part of any official design. Some were sealed, others disappeared from the paperwork. One worker claimed they were instructed to leave it alone. Another said the tunnel curved downward far deeper than it should have, like it wasn't meant to come back up. Of course, none of this is in the official reports, but that hasn't stopped presidents and staff from referencing the tunnels over the years. Bill Clinton once joked about secret hallways. Michelle Obama mentioned being guided through an underground passage her first night in the White House because above ground it was chaos. And Donald Trump, during the height of 2020 protests, was reportedly escorted to a secure bunker beneath the White House. The public laughed, but insiders said the movement was real and fast. So how deep does it go? Is it just security theater, or is there a whole underworld of power hidden beneath Pennsylvania Avenue? Some theorists even believe the tunnels have other purposes: smuggling, spying, rituals, escape. The entrances are sealed. The maps are classified, and the workers who built them, dead, retired, or sworn to silence, which leaves us with one unsettling thought. Every time the president disappears from public view, he might just be walking into the walls. The secret Jefferson ciphers. When you write the Declaration of Independence, everyone calls you a genius. When you start inventing secret codes in your spare time, they stop asking questions. Thomas Jefferson didn't just help found the United States. He architected its philosophy, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. He made it sound simple, but Jefferson himself? Not simple. He was a polymath, a contradiction, a man who championed freedom while owning hundreds of slaves, who believed in the Enlightenment but hoarded secrets like a 1700s tech bro. He also had a thing for ciphers. Jefferson didn't trust open communication. Letters were routinely intercepted in those days by the British, by the French, by nosy political enemies who liked to blackmail their way into influence. So he invented the Jefferson disk cipher, a mechanical device consisting of rotating disks, each marked with letters of the alphabet in random order. It allowed for encrypted messages, pure substitution cipher, revolutionary for its time. The military would later adopt a version of it in World War II, calling it the Bozzery's cylinder, which means Jefferson may have accidentally invented modern encryption between dinner parties and estate management. But here's the thing, the device wasn't the weird part. The weird part is what he used it for, because to this day there are documents in Jefferson's hand that remain uncracked. Letters filled with odd spacing, inconsistent capitalization, unusual symbols, and archaic phrasing, some of which scholars believe may contain personal ciphers that have never been solved. Some of them were letters to close allies. Others were seemingly innocuous, but why encrypt a shopping list? Why hide letters to people you supposedly trusted? Historians have pored over them. Cryptanalysts have tried breaking the patterns. Some of the documents appear coded, but reveal gibberish when decrypted, suggesting either a lost key, a double encryption, or misdirection. Was Jefferson playing a long game? Was he hiding state secrets in plain sight? Or worse, was he just hiding himself? Because Jefferson was obsessed with legacy. He wanted to be remembered a certain way, not just as a politician, but as a philosopher king, one whose deeper meanings would only be understood centuries later by a more enlightened generation. You know, like us. Of course, there's another theory. Jefferson used ciphers not to preserve truth, but to bury it. Encrypted correspondence could easily disappear. The key dies with the man. If you had a scandal to bury or a contradiction to suppress, say a second family hidden from polite society, why not use your own custom-made code? Even the famed Jefferson Bible, in which he surgically removed all miracles from the New Testament, reads like a man obsessed with hiding messages in plain sight, gospel as redacted text, philosophy as cipher. We still don't know what all of his ciphers said, or whether they meant anything at all. And maybe that's the cruelest trick of all, to spend your life encrypting your thoughts so only you can read them, and then die without ever telling anyone the password. Still with me? Good. That means you're the kind of person who enjoys peeling back layers that were never meant to be touched. Like, subscribe and keep going. We're nowhere near done. The death of President Warren G. Harding, heart attack, or something else. Officially, he died in his sleep. Unofficially, he took something to help him sleep and never woke up. August 2nd, 1923. President Warren G. Harding dies suddenly in a hotel suite in San Francisco, partway through a cross-country voyage of understanding. The official story, a heart attack. Natural causes, case closed. But if Harding's death was natural, it was also awfully convenient, because by 1923, his presidency was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. His administration had become a circus of bribery, cronyism, and corporate kickbacks. At the center of it all was the infamous Teapot Dome scandal, involving illegal oil leases, secret deals, and enough cash changing hands to buy the Wyoming prairie 3 times over. Harding didn't mastermind the scandal, but he let it happen. He appointed the men who did, and he knew the walls were closing in. His sudden death, perfect timing. And here's where things start to rot. First, the symptoms. Harding had been feeling unwell for days. Fatigue, nausea, chest pain. His doctor, Charles Sawyer, wasn't a cardiologist. He wasn't even particularly competent. He was a homeopathic physician, handpicked by Harding's wife, Florence. His response to the president's symptoms? Administer caffeine and laxatives. Then came the death itself. Harding reportedly died in bed, reading a flattering article his wife had just shown him. He supposedly exclaimed, "That's good," then dropped dead. Peaceful, clean, cinematic. Almost too cinematic. No autopsy was performed. Let's repeat that. The President of the United States died suddenly and no autopsy was performed. Why? Florence Harding said no. She insisted he had suffered from heart problems, that the stress did him in, that there was no mystery here, just overwork and a weak constitution. But Florence wasn't just grieving, she was protecting something. The moment Harding died, she burned his papers, not metaphorically, literally. Letters, correspondence, possibly private journals. Entire swaths of the Harding presidency went up in smoke before historians could even ask what they were. She also kept Sawyer as the official voice on Harding's death, which makes sense. He was the doctor who never asked questions, conveniently loyal, conveniently silent. Decades later, whispers began to emerge. Some suggested Harding had been poisoned to stop him from testifying, from confessing, from turning on the men in his cabinet before they dragged him down with them. Others believed Florence did it, not out of malice, but out of desperation, to spare her husband humiliation, or herself, or both. After all, Harding had numerous affairs, at least one child out of wedlock, a stream of scandals, and a growing number of enemies. And Florence, she knew everything. She may not have pulled the trigger, but she definitely held the match. To this day, there's no official cause of death beyond natural causes. No exhumation, no toxicology, just a presidential corpse, a locked hotel room, and a widow with a fireplace full of state secrets. So what killed Warren G. Harding? Stress? Betrayal? Or something a little more dissolvable in water? One thing's for sure. The only thing more suspicious than Harding's death is how hard everyone worked to move on. The lost drafts of the Gettysburg Address, 77 years ago, and at least one version of the speech has disappeared since. It's 1863. The Civil War is halfway through its bloodbath, and America is halfway through tearing itself apart. At the dedication of a national cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a place still soaked in death, President Abraham Lincoln rises to give a few appropriate remarks. The speech lasts less than 3 minutes, 10 sentences, roughly 272 words. That's all it takes. But somehow, in those few breaths, Lincoln reshaped the moral foundation of the country. He didn't just honor the dead. He reframed the war. He turned it from a conflict over secession into a battle for the soul of democracy itself. It became the speech, the sacred one, the one kids memorize and stumble through in classrooms generations later, the one that somehow manages to feel like scripture without ever invoking a god. But there's a problem. No one knows which version of the speech Lincoln actually delivered. Today, there are 5 surviving drafts of the Gettysburg Address, each with subtle but significant differences. They're named for the people they were given to: Nicolay, Hay, Everett, Bancroft, Bliss. Each has slightly different punctuation, different word choice. In some, he says, "under God." In others, he doesn't. And here's where the mystery unfolds. None of them match exactly what contemporary reporters wrote down that day. None of them quite sync with eyewitness recollections, and none of them, not a single one, appears to be a clean, final reading copy. Which means the version Lincoln actually spoke aloud? Gone, lost to history. This raises a terrifying question. Is the most famous speech in American history an approximation? The Nicolay and Hay drafts are considered the earliest. They're messy, handwritten, possibly rehearsal versions. The Bliss copy, clean and signed, is often printed in textbooks, but it was written after the event, from memory. Did Lincoln read from notes? Speak extemporaneously? Edit as he spoke? Historians have debated it for decades. Some think the speech was written on the train. Others say it was meticulously prepared in advance, but no original manuscript, the manuscript, has ever been found. And that's the mystery. How does a speech this iconic, delivered by a president whose every word was scrutinized, go undocumented in its final form? Some suspect it's still out there, hidden in a forgotten folder in a small-town archive, tucked between correspondence and drafts in some Civil War general's attic, maybe even buried in a private collection, never recognized for what it is. Or maybe Lincoln destroyed it himself. He was, after all, a man obsessed with humility. He knew the power of myth, and he knew that once something becomes sacred, people stop questioning it. Maybe losing the original was the point, because without a definitive version, the speech becomes fluid, interpretive, a kind of national Rorschach test. What we hear in it reveals what we want America to be: a country reborn, a dream deferred, or just a promise waiting to be kept. What matters is this: we lost the first version of the speech that defined America. The question is, was that by accident or design? The disappearance of the White House Easter egg roll records. It's a children's game, but in Washington, even games leave a paper trail. or they're supposed to. Every spring, the south lawn of the White House transforms into something peculiar. A stage for toddlers with baskets, over-caffeinated parents, and costumed mascots trying to keep it together under the weight of heat and history. It's called the White House Easter egg roll, a pastel-colored ritual complete with wooden spoons, squealing children, and photo ops so carefully choreographed they might as well be CGI. It's adorable. It's harmless. It's also a mystery. Here's the thing. No one actually knows when it really started, or how. The earliest official account places the tradition with President Rutherford B. Hayes in 1878, after Congress banned egg rolling on Capitol grounds because apparently children having fun on the lawn was a national threat. Hayes reportedly opened the White House lawn to the public instead, and thus a new tradition was born. Neat, clean origin story, tied up with a bow, except not quite. There are persistent rumors, local newspaper clippings, and anecdotal evidence suggesting that the event may have taken place earlier, before Hayes, possibly as far back as President Andrew Johnson, maybe even earlier. Some reports mention egg rolling events in D.C. that happened during the 1860s, possibly on the Capitol lawn, possibly near the White House. So, where are the records? They're gone, missing, misfiled, never created. It's unclear. White House archives contain detailed logs for everything from state dinners to dog names. But for some reason, this one tradition, the one still going strong nearly 150 years later, has a gap, a yawning pastel-colored void in the paper trail. And it's not just the origin year that's foggy. There's also uncertainty about how the event was paused during wars, revived under different presidents, and changed over time. Photographic records are spotty. Guest lists disappeared. Gift inventories, incomplete. It's like history didn't consider it worth preserving until it became untouchable. So we're left with a legend. Hayes started it, maybe, but what if it wasn't that clean? What if it began as a casual, unsanctioned gathering? What if it was a tradition stolen from DC's black communities, who had their own Easter celebrations, public and vibrant? Long before the White House opened its lawn, some historians argue that egg roll is a perfect case study in how American traditions get whitewashed, cleaned up, rebranded, turned from organic culture into official spectacle. Others simply call it poor record keeping, bureaucratic forgetfulness, the National Archives equivalent of losing your baby photos. But in Washington, accidental history is rarely accidental. So maybe the real mystery isn't when the egg roll started. Maybe it's who started it and why we chose the story we did. Because even when the kids are rolling eggs down a slope, somebody else is rolling history uphill. The identity of Deep Throat before we knew. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one nobody can name. In the early 1970s, the walls of the Nixon administration began to crack. It started with a strange little break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex. 5 men. Cheap suits. Bad luck. But what looked like a low-budget political burglary became a slow-motion coup against the truth. Because someone on the inside began to talk. Not publicly, not loudly, just consistently. The source was anonymous. The information was explosive. And the reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, gave him a nickname that would become synonymous with American whistleblowing. Deep Throat. The name, borrowed from a popular and deeply NSFW film of the time, was supposed to be a joke, but history didn't laugh. It leaned in. Deep Throat wasn't just a source. He was the source. He gave direction, context, and, most importantly, confirmation. He didn't leak documents. He pointed, nudged, verified. He guided Woodward and Bernstein through a labyrinth of lies and back channels, one anonymous rendezvous at a time. Famously, they met in the parking garage of an office building in Rosslyn, Virginia. Woodward would place a red flag in a flower pot on his balcony to signal he needed a meeting. The signal back? A simple marking on page 20 of his copy of the New York Times, journalism's most famous scavenger hunt. But for decades, the mystery wasn't just what Deep Throat knew. It was who he was. Speculation was a national sport. Dozens of names were floated. Nixon's speechwriter, Alexander Haig, Henry Kissinger, Pat Buchanan, even Barbara Walters' father somehow made the list. Everyone had a theory. Everyone was wrong. Woodward and Bernstein refused to reveal the identity. So did their editor. Even when asked point blank in court, they stonewalled. Deep Throat's identity became the Cold War's weird little subplot. One of those mysteries you just accepted would never be solved, until it was. In 2005, Vanity Fair revealed the truth. Deep Throat was Mark Felt, Associate Director of the FBI, number 2 in command, a man Nixon had passed over for director, a man with motive, access, and just enough moral clarity to take the whole house down from the inside. So, mystery solved. Story over, right? Not quite, because Felt didn't come forward out of civic duty. He was 91, suffering from dementia. The confession came via his family, who may have nudged him to reveal it for legacy, or for money, or both. Even Woodward admitted that Felt wasn't some idealistic martyr. He was flawed, ambitious, complicated, and that's what makes it even better. Deep Throat wasn't a mythic truth teller. He was a man, bitter, sidelined, but still unwilling to watch the Constitution burn. So yes, we know the name now, but the mystery still lingers. Would the truth have come out without him? Would Nixon have resigned? Would anyone else have listened? Or do we still need the anonymous whistleblower in the shadows, pointing a flashlight at the machinery of power and whispering just loud enough to be dangerous? Sometimes the voice matters more than the name. The disappearance of the White House's original blueprints. The House of the People has no floor plan. Which begs the question, what were they trying to hide or forget? Imagine designing a building that would come to symbolize the center of global power, a structure that would house presidents, generals, secrets, and scandals for over 2 centuries. Now imagine losing the instructions. The White House, formerly known as the Executive Mansion, was designed by Irish-born architect James Hoban in 1792, a neoclassical confection of symmetry and ambition. It was modeled partly after Leinster House in Dublin, but tailored for the swagger of a brand new republic that wanted to look respectable while still figuring out how to not collapse. Construction was slow, painstaking, stone by stone. Slavery-powered labor and government anxiety fused into something iconic, and at its center was a blueprint, a set of original architectural plans that laid out the rooms, the walls, the vision. Those blueprints? Gone. Not lost during the 1814 British invasion when the White House was burned to a crisp. Not during the Civil War. Not even during the major 20th century renovations. Just gone. Like a magician's reveal with no flourish, only the silence of bureaucracy. To this day, the US government has no known copy of the original Hoban floor plans. How do you misplace the literal skeleton of your capital's heart? Well, the official explanation is predictably vague. Something destruction, something record keeping. Perhaps the originals were destroyed in the 1814 fire, or during the 1902 Roosevelt renovation, or during the Truman era gutting in the 1940s and 50s, when much of the White House interior was completely dismantled and rebuilt. Steel frame, new concrete foundation, a mid-century rebar makeover hidden inside a historic shell. But here's where it gets strange. We do have some early renderings of Hoban's designs, drawings, letters, sketches, just not the master plan. And over time, architectural changes layered over those originals like scars over bone, multiple renovations, structural reinforcements, secret compartments, hidden service corridors, alleged escape routes. The result, even today, no one, not the Secret Service, not the National Archives, not the White House Historical Association, has a definitive, complete, publicly confirmed blueprint of what lies behind every wall, beneath every floor. Some of it's classified, some of it's forgotten. Some of it, they claim, was never recorded to begin with, which sounds like security protocol, until you remember that the building's original layout wasn't supposed to be secret. So either we lost the blueprints through carelessness, impressive given the stakes, or someone made sure they wouldn't be found. Because here's a theory, when you lose the blueprints, you also lose accountability. No one can ask, what was here before this room? No one can trace, where does that tunnel really go? No one can see what got erased, and maybe that's the whole point. The White House isn't just a house. It's a narrative, one that gets remodeled, repainted, and rewritten, depending on who's living in it. And if that narrative ever cracks, If someone finds a door they weren't supposed to open, it's helpful not to have a map. The Truman balcony controversy, it was just a balcony, unless it wasn't, unless it was a symbol, a scandal, or something he wasn't supposed to see. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman decided he wanted a balcony, just a balcony. Second floor, south side of the White House, overlooking the lawn where children rolled eggs and cameras rolled history. He said it was practical. He said it provided shade. He said it gave the first family a place to sit, relax, and look out over the world they were supposed to be leading. The country said, "How dare you?" Within days of Truman announcing the addition, the press had a meltdown. The architecture crowd called it a desecration. Congress sniped from the sidelines. Critics accused Truman of turning the White House into a cheap hotel. Editorial cartoons mocked it as a dictator's perch, somewhere between Mussolini and Miami Beach. You'd think he declared martial law. He just wanted a view, but Washington never sees just a balcony. In D.C., everything is a metaphor or a threat. And Truman? He wasn't exactly a man who played by interior design rules. He was the guy who dropped 2 atomic bombs. He fired a war hero. He said what he meant, and if he wanted a balcony, by God, he was going to build it. But here's where it gets murky. Truman claimed the balcony was necessary due to structural issues with the south portico's columns. A practical decision, he said. Engineer approved. But critics weren't buying it. Some believed the balcony was symbolic, an imperial gesture at a time when Americans were uneasy with post-war authority. Others believed it was political, meant to reshape the image of the presidency from secluded bureaucrat to front porch neighbor. And then there's the conspiracy theory that the balcony wasn't really for sunbathing or sipping bourbon. It was a lookout, a way for Truman to personally monitor the grounds, the press, the protests, or maybe it was for someone else to watch him. Because 1948 was a bad year to feel secure in Washington. The Soviets had nukes. The Cold War had begun. Paranoia was practically part of the dress code. And the Secret Service didn't love having the president hanging over a ledge in plain view. Yet, Truman insisted. He approved the design himself. The cost? $16,050. The impact? Far more. But here's the strange part. Today, we accept the Truman balcony without a second thought. It's iconic, part of the building, seamless. And yet, no other architectural update to the White House, no new wing, no security modification, no landscaping decision has ever caused quite so much political whiplash. So maybe the balcony wasn't controversial because it was ugly. Maybe it was because it was honest. A president wanting space to breathe, to watch, to be watched. Because in Washington, the most threatening thing a leader can do is build a place to stand where everyone can see him and where he can see them right back. The alleged haunting by Abigail Adams. She walked the halls before they were finished, and maybe she never left. The year is 1800. The paint is still drying. The city is half swamp, half smoke, and the brand new executive mansion, later known as the White House, is barely more than a glorified construction site. Enter Abigail Adams, First Lady, reluctant political spouse, fierce intellect, sharp tongue, devoted wife to John Adams, the nation's second president. She arrives in Washington with low expectations and even lower patience for discomfort. The White House as she found it was a drafty, half-built shell. No plumbing, no insulation, no furniture to speak of. But Abigail was practical. She made it work. And by made it work, we mean she hung the family laundry in the East Room. That's right, the grand ballroom of state. She turned it into a drying rack. In her letters, she described the room as the only one large and dry enough to hang the wash. She joked about it, but you could feel the weight between the lines. She wasn't just hanging shirts. She was trying to domesticate power, to make a palace livable, to carve humanity into marble. But here's the part history doesn't write down. She may still be there. For over a century, staff and guests at the White House have reported seeing the ghost of Abigail Adams. Not a phantom in chains, not a wailing shade. Something quieter, sadder, realer. A figure in early 19th century dress, arms outstretched as if carrying linens. Seen most often in the East Room, her makeshift laundry room. Walking calmly, purposefully, sometimes vanishing into thin air, sometimes simply fading, as though she were never quite there to begin with. The air grows colder when she's near. Some say it smells faintly of soap and damp linen. Others just feel watched. And here's the strange part. It's always the East Room. Not the bedrooms, not the hallways, just that one grand space. Even Winston Churchill, who claimed to have seen Lincoln's ghost elsewhere, reportedly avoided the East Room at night, not out of fear, out of respect for someone still doing her chores. So, why does Abigail linger? Is it devotion to the house, to the role she was handed by history? Or maybe it's not a haunting at all. Maybe it's a lesson. Maybe every first lady leaves something behind. Not just scrapbooks and state dinners, but fingerprints on the walls. A presence that outlasts policy, that haunts not with chains, but with quiet insistence. Because while the men wrote laws and waged wars, it was the women who made the White House a home, and some homes never forget their first mother. The strange case of President Andrew Jackson's parrot. When the president died, they said a few words. So did his parrot. Unfortunately, most of them were unprintable. Andrew Jackson was a man of contradictions, a war hero and a populist, a slave owner and a duelist, a president who punched upward, downward, and occasionally sideways. He survived assassination attempts, fought banks like they were personal enemies, and carried bullets in his body for most of his life. In other words, subtlety was not his brand. So it shouldn't be surprising that he owned a parrot. But this was no ordinary parrot. Its name was Paul, short for Polly possibly, or maybe just a name chosen with zero imagination. Either way, it was a blue and yellow macaw, bright, bold, and, as history would discover, profane. Paul was Jackson's companion late in life. Some say he was a gift. Others say Jackson bought the bird himself, perhaps charmed by its colors or its temperament. He reportedly taught it to speak, as many parrot owners do. Big mistake, because Paul didn't just repeat polite small talk. Paul repeated Andrew Jackson, and if you know anything about Jackson, you know that the man swore like a pirate in a bar fight. Fast forward to June 1845, Jackson's dead. A funeral is held at the Hermitage, his Tennessee plantation, attended by hundreds of mourners, dignitaries, and clergy. It was meant to be a solemn affair, heavy with scripture and honor. Then came the parrot. As the preacher began his eulogy, Paul, perched somewhere within earshot, decided to offer commentary. Loud, graphic, relentless. According to multiple first-hand accounts, the bird began swearing uncontrollably during the ceremony. Not just the odd curse word, full-blown, sailor-grade profanity, strings of obscenity so creative and sustained that the preacher reportedly had to pause the service until the bird could be removed. Mourners were shocked. Children cried. Some found it hilarious. Others whispered that Jackson's spirit had entered the parrot. One woman fainted, and the preacher, he later described it as an awful performance of wickedness, which raises several uncomfortable questions. Did Paul really know what he was saying? Had Jackson deliberately trained him to curse? Was this some elaborate posthumous prank from a man who always said what others were too polite to think? Or was it something stranger? Because animals don't usually disrupt funerals. They don't usually deliver last rites in four-letter words. And they certainly don't speak with the uncanny timing of a man who always had to have the last word. Paul lived on after Jackson. What became of the bird is unclear. Some say he was gifted to a friend. Others believe he died not long after, perhaps from grief, or maybe just from running out of fresh material. But the story endured. Because in a nation obsessed with dignity and decorum, it was a bird, a literal parrot, who reminded us that power, in the end, is just another voice waiting to be repeated, loud, crude, and unforgettable. The case of the secret love letters between Lincoln and Speed. If two men share a bed for 4 years and write aching letters when apart, does history call it friendship, or just change the subject? Abraham Lincoln was many things. A lawyer, a log splitter, a wartime president, a melancholy philosopher trapped in a tall frame, and, depending on how you read the historical record, a man with a secret. In the late 1830s, Lincoln lived in Springfield, Illinois, before the presidency, before Mary Todd, before the Civil War turned his name into a monument. He was just a young lawyer, broke, ambitious, and profoundly lonely. Enter Joshua Fry Speed. The son of a wealthy Kentucky planter, Speed was charismatic, well-connected, and in possession of something Lincoln desperately needed: A bed. Lincoln moved into the room above Speed's general store. They didn't just share rent, they shared the bed for 4 years. Now, this wasn't entirely unusual in the 19th century. Bed sharing between men was common on the frontier, mostly for practical and economic reasons. But here's where it gets complicated. The letters between Lincoln and Speed don't read like two men who simply split the cost of threadbare sheets. They read like heartbreak. When Speed returned to Kentucky in 1841, Lincoln fell into a deep, paralyzing depression. Friends feared for his life. He stopped eating. He withdrew. He wrote letters full of emotional desperation and poetic longing. Not just over Speed's absence, but over Speed's possible marriage. Eventually, Speed did marry, and so did Lincoln, but not before an extended period of correspondence between the two, filled with phrases like, "When the conduct of men is designed to be influence, persuasion, kind, unassuming persuasion should ever be adopted," or this, "I am not very well. I fear I must die of this, unless I get better." And then there's this cryptic line from Lincoln to Speed, "You know my desire to befriend you is everlasting, that I will never cease while I know how to do anything." Was it the language of friendship, or was it love filtered through the emotional syntax available to men who weren't allowed to love each other? Historians are divided. The traditionalists insist it was platonic, that Lincoln was prone to sentiment. The 19th century men were more expressive with each other than we are now, without implying romance. Others aren't so sure. They point to Lincoln's discomfort with women in his youth, his cold engagement to Mary Todd, his documented periods of emotional collapse, and perhaps most intriguingly, his later, often awkward relationships with male aides, particularly Captain David Derrickson, who allegedly shared Lincoln's bed while Mary was away. No smoking gun, just smoke. Lots of it. The letters between Lincoln and Speed still exist. You can read them yourself. They're public, fragile, and fiercely debated. Some were edited, some may have been destroyed. But the ones we have, they leave space. They leave room for something unspoken. So was Abraham Lincoln gay? Bisexual? Emotionally dependent? Romantically closeted? We don't know. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not whether Lincoln loved Joshua Speed, but why we're still afraid to ask the question. The unsolved break-ins at Democratic headquarters before Watergate. History tends to notice the explosion, but if you listen closely, there's always a clicking sound before the bomb goes off. Everyone remembers the break-in at the Watergate complex on June 17, 1972. 5 men, caught red-handed, taped doors, lockpicks, wiretaps. The scandal that followed toppled a presidency and redefined the phrase cover-up. But what almost no one remembers is that it wasn't the first time. In the months leading up to that infamous break-in, a series of smaller, less publicized intrusions took place. Strange, unclaimed, quietly unresolved. And the Democratic National Committee wasn't the only target. In late 1971 and early 72, several reports trickled in. Democratic campaign offices across the country, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, reported suspicious activity. Doors found unlocked that had been locked the night before, cabinets left open, files shuffled. In some cases, nothing appeared stolen. Nothing obvious anyway, which made it worse, because whoever was entering these offices wasn't looking for money. They were looking for information. And they weren't sloppy. In February 1972, 4 months before the famous Watergate break-in, a burglary took place at the DNC's headquarters in D.C. Not the break-in, a break-in. It was written off as petty theft, an inside job. Nothing came of it, except it bore the same hallmarks. No broken windows, no alarms triggered, just missing files, and silence. So what were they after? According to later testimony, some of these early break-ins may have been test runs, practice missions, trial and error operations designed to map out office layouts, test alarm systems, measure police response times. That theory would make sense if we accept that Watergate was an isolated rogue operation. But what if it wasn't? What if the early break-ins were intentional diversions, part of a larger coordinated campaign of surveillance and sabotage? There's evidence, buried in dusty Senate reports and whispered memoirs, that the Nixon administration wasn't just targeting the DNC. They were targeting journalists, student activists, think tanks, even their own staff. It was called the Plumbers Unit, and it operated like a gang of political ghosts, burglars, wiretappers, saboteurs. They even broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist to dig up dirt on the man who leaked the Pentagon Papers. This wasn't one break-in. This was a mindset. And when they got caught at Watergate, suddenly everyone forgot the others. No suspects were arrested for the earlier incidents. No fingerprints matched. No files recovered. The trail went cold, as it was always supposed to. But here's the real mystery. Why weren't those earlier break-ins investigated harder after Watergate broke? Why did the national focus zero in on one crime and quietly bury the others? Maybe because the truth wasn't just about one president. Maybe it was about the system, a system that had grown so paranoid, so hungry for control, that it no longer recognized the difference between security and sabotage. So we remember the big fall, but we forget the soft footsteps leading up to the ledge, and maybe that's exactly how they planned it. The vanishing of Roosevelt's Black Chamber files. It was America's first code-breaking unit. Then it disappeared, and so did everything it ever did. Before the CIA, before the NSA, before surveillance had a logo and a budget line, there was the Black Chamber, officially known as the Cipher Bureau. The Black Chamber was the United States' first peacetime cryptographic organization. It was founded after World War I, when President Woodrow Wilson and his advisors realized something simple but terrifying. The best way to win an argument is to read your opponent's mail. It operated out of New York City, a small gray office, unremarkable on the outside. Inside, a different story. Typewriters, encryption wheels, secret codes written and broken, letters opened and resealed, ambassadors spied on, allies and enemies alike. Its mission was simple: intercept and decode foreign communications. Its methods, not so simple. Led by a brilliant linguist and cryptanalyst named Herbert O. Yardley, the Black Chamber worked in total secrecy. Yardley and his staff cracked diplomatic codes, deciphered encrypted telegrams, and compiled detailed dossiers on nearly every major foreign power, including Britain and Japan. They had successes. Big ones. Trade negotiations, diplomatic leverage, secret alliances exposed. Then in 1929, just as the chamber hit its stride, something happened. It was shut down. Overnight, the order came from Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson, who famously said, "Gentlemen do not read each other's mail." Stimson thought the practice was unethical, or at least inconvenient. Surveillance in peacetime made the U.S. look bad. It complicated alliances. It violated diplomatic trust. So the Black Chamber was disbanded. And then the files disappeared. Not archived, not declassified, not transferred to another agency. Gone. Yardley, disillusioned, unemployed, and angry, eventually published a tell-all book in 1931, The American Black Chamber. It revealed some of the chamber's operations, but it also raised a darker question. Where was the rest of the story? Hundreds, possibly thousands, of reports, cipher keys, foreign code books, intercepted messages, intelligence analyses, all vanished. Were they destroyed? Were they absorbed into a different program? Or were they hidden? Some believe the files were quietly transferred to a then top-secret military cryptography program, the precursor to the NSA. Others think they were burned to avoid diplomatic embarrassment. Still others suggest they're buried in private government archives under vague labels like miscellaneous operations or foreign technical correspondence, but no one knows for sure. And here's the strange part. When the U.S. found itself caught off guard by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, just 12 years later, some historians wondered aloud, would the attack have been prevented if the Black Chamber had still existed? Or worse, did we already know something and hide it? Because when intelligence disappears, so does accountability. And when the government erases the evidence of surveillance, the only thing you can be certain of is that it worked. So the files remain missing, the codes remain cracked, but the truth still encrypted. The story behind FDR's hidden health crisis. They said he was strong. He said he was fine. The wheelchair said otherwise, but America wasn't looking at it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected 4 times. He led the United States through the Great Depression and into the Second World War. He gave hope, he gave orders, and he gave speeches that sounded like victory itself. What he didn't give, at least not to the public, was the truth about his health. Because for most of his presidency, FDR was a man at war with his own body, and the nation never knew how bad it really was. It began in 1921. Roosevelt, then 39, was vacationing at Campobello Island when he suddenly fell ill. Fever, weakness. Within days, he was paralyzed from the waist down. The diagnosis, poliomyelitis, polio. He never walked unaided again, but he didn't let it stop him. With sheer force of will and some incredibly choreographed political theater, FDR re-entered public life. He built an image of strength, optimism, and mobility. The cane became a prop. The wheelchair was hidden from view, and the illusion, flawless, mostly. Photos were staged. Public appearances were engineered with ramps, handrails, Secret Service agents posed as aides. Speeches were delivered standing, but only after being hoisted upright and locked into position behind the podium. And the press? They played along. Out of respect, out of fear, out of patriotism, maybe all three. In an era before TMZ and Twitter, this kind of illusion could survive. But it wasn't just the wheelchair that was hidden. It was the entire reality of his health. By the 1940s, Roosevelt wasn't just paraplegic. He was sick, really sick. He had congestive heart failure, high blood pressure so severe it could have killed a lesser man walking upstairs, arteriosclerosis, a wildly enlarged heart, a body on the edge of collapse. By 1944, during his fourth presidential campaign, Roosevelt was visibly gaunt, pale, his speech slower. His hands trembled when he held his cigarette. His doctors knew he might not survive the term. And yet, none of this was disclosed. A naval doctor signed off on his excellent health. Photographers were banned from capturing candid shots. His personal physician, Dr. Ross McIntyre, reassured the press and the public that FDR was as vigorous as ever. He died 5 months into his fourth term, April 12th, 1945. Cerebral hemorrhage. His body gave out just weeks before the Nazis surrendered. The man who had led the free world through chaos didn't make it to the end. So here's the mystery. Was the secrecy a noble deception, a wartime necessity, or was it a lie that denied the public the chance to prepare for succession and accountability? Because the transition to Harry S. Truman was abrupt, and Truman until that point had been largely sidelined. He hadn't even been briefed on the Manhattan Project when FDR died. That's right. He didn't know about the atomic bomb. Because Roosevelt was too ill, too isolated, or too possessive of power to bring his successor into the fold. And that's the terrifying part. When the president is sick, who's actually in charge? The doctor, the spouse, the generals, the staffer with the sharpest suit? We'll never know the full truth about FDR's health because he didn't want us to, and because no one had the courage or the clearance to say otherwise. The missing presidential time capsules. Presidents love to talk to the future, but sometimes the future forgets to dig them up. Presidents are legacy junkies. They write memoirs, they build libraries, they stage portraits with lighting so perfect it would make Rembrandt weep. But sometimes they go a little deeper, underground. Time capsules. They've been a favorite of American politicians for over a century. Bury a box, fill it with letters, artifacts, coins, speeches, tiny cultural fossils wrapped in ceremonial optimism. Then forget about it for 50 or 100 years and hope someone gives a damn when the time comes. Several presidents have participated in the ritual. Dwight D. Eisenhower is said to have buried a time capsule at the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center in 1959. The capsule allegedly contained letters, predictions for the year 2000, and perhaps even classified material that was meant to be unsealed during the new millennium. It was never found. No plaque, no marker, no records indicating precisely where it was placed. Just a hazy mention in a ceremony transcript and the collective shrug of the National Archives. Then there's Richard Nixon. According to multiple eyewitnesses and White House aides, Nixon expressed a strong interest in creating a sealed record of his presidency, his version of events. Some say he compiled letters and objects in a personal capsule meant to be buried near his future presidential library. It was never confirmed, and after Watergate, even his allies distanced themselves from any project that sounded like it might backfire with a shovel. Some time capsule projects were announced with great fanfare, then quietly shelved. Others were buried but never documented, and some just vanished. In the 1980s, a time capsule was reportedly interred beneath the renovation of the White House Rose Garden, allegedly containing personal items from the Reagan administration. 20 years later, a construction crew working on a nearby project scanned the site. Nothing. Same with a rumored capsule buried during Harry S. Truman's massive White House gut renovation. No record, no trace. So, where did they go? Did the capsules disintegrate over time? Were they moved? Were they never buried at all? Some historians believe they were deliberately destroyed because the contents were deemed too embarrassing or politically risky. Others point to the vast construction and reconstruction that's taken place over the years. When you rebuild a house multiple times over 200 years, especially one built on secrets, some things just get buried deeper than you planned. Or maybe, just maybe, the time capsules are still there, waiting. Tiny presidential black boxes hidden in concrete and clay. A message in a bottle addressed to a future that may never read it. And that's the haunting part. These weren't messages to us. They were messages to someone we were supposed to become. Someone worthy. So, what happens when the future shows up and forgets to open the mail? The secretive pardon of Richard Nixon. He resigned to avoid impeachment. Then he avoided everything else. Justice, trial, testimony, all erased with a single stroke of the pen. September 8th, 1974. 1 month after Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace, his successor, Gerald R. Ford, walks into the White House press room and reads a short, dense, almost mechanical statement. I grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States, which he has committed or may have committed or taken part in. That's it. No criminal charges, no confession, no court case, just absolution. Preemptive, total, and immediate. It was the most sweeping act of presidential forgiveness in U.S. history, and maybe the most suspicious. Because no one saw it coming, Ford had only just taken the oath of office after Nixon's resignation. He was still polishing his image as a humble, healing force. The country was angry, tired, raw from Watergate, hungry for justice, and then nothing, just a pardon, which raises a question that has never really gone away. Was there a deal? Ford always denied it. He insisted that Nixon had not asked for, nor been promised, a pardon in exchange for resigning, that the pardon was given to end our national nightmare and help the country move on. But not everyone bought it. Political commentators, lawmakers, and even members of Ford's own staff suspected there had been an understanding, a gentleman's agreement, a backroom exchange. You leave quietly, and we'll make sure you don't go to prison. Especially strange, Ford issued the pardon before any formal charges were filed against Nixon, which means Nixon wasn't pardoned for a specific crime. He was pardoned for whatever he might have done. It was a blanket of immunity so broad, it didn't just cover the past. It covered any possible future legal scrutiny. No trial, no subpoena, no testimony, which is convenient, not just for Nixon, but for anyone else in his inner circle who might have been dragged into court if Nixon had started talking under oath. The fallout was immediate. Ford's approval rating tanked. He was accused of participating in a cover-up. Protesters lined Pennsylvania Avenue. Members of Congress called for investigations. Some wanted to reverse the pardon. Legally, politically, or just symbolically. They failed. And Nixon, he kept quiet, gave a few carefully curated interviews, wrote some books, lived a long, comfortably disgraced life in California. Ford later admitted the pardon cost him the 1976 election, but he stood by it, claimed it was an act of mercy, of healing, of letting the nation turn the page. But the page wasn't blank. It was redacted, because if there was a deal, if Ford knowingly shielded Nixon from prosecution in exchange for a peaceful transfer of power, then what we got wasn't closure. It was silence in exchange for stability. And silence in Washington is never free. The mystery of the vanishing presidential pets. They come in with parades, portraits, and press. But some of them just never leave. Or worse, leave without a trace. The The White House has a long, fuzzy tradition. The first pet, dogs, cats, raccoons, goats, parrots, even a bear cub or two. For more than 2 centuries, presidents have paraded their pets before the public as symbols of relatability, softness, and domestic bliss, because nothing humanizes a nuclear launch code holder like a slobbering retriever or cat named Socks. But here's what no one tells you. Some of those animals disappeared. Take Macaroni, a pony gifted to Caroline Kennedy, JFK's daughter. He became something of a media darling, featured in Life magazine, fed sugar cubes by diplomats, paraded on the South Lawn. Then one day, poof, gone. No ceremony, no retirement, no record of transfer to another farm or stable. Just vanished from the public story. When asked, the Kennedy family offered vague responses. Given to a friend, sent to a farm, etc. Phrases that sound suspiciously like the ones your parents used when the family hamster died. And then there's Pushinka, a dog given to the Kennedys by Nikita Khrushchev, a Cold War puppy with geopolitical pedigree. She was the daughter of a Soviet space dog, part of an olive branch wrapped in fur. She had puppies with JFK's other dog, Charlie. Cute story, adorable litter. Then, silence. The puppies were reportedly adopted out, but Pushinka herself quietly slipped out of the press narrative after the assassination. No burial story, no public goodbye, just cold pause and cooler diplomacy. And then there's Checkers, Nixon's famous dog, immortalized in the emotional Checkers speech that helped save his political career. The black and white Cocker Spaniel became a national symbol, except Checkers never actually lived in the White House. She died before Nixon took office, and when asked about her later, Nixon rarely talked about what happened, which leads to one of the more unsettling possibilities. What if these disappearances aren't just benign? What if presidential pets are quietly removed for reasons of optics, of temperament, of politics? Historians have pointed out that pets are often acquired for campaigns, but quietly rehomed when they don't fit the press narrative. Too loud, too aggressive, too indifferent to photo ops. And in some cases, especially during transitions, records vanish. No adoption logs, no veterinary notes, just another piece of soft power swept under the rug. In recent years, even with modern press saturation, some first pets still quietly exit stage left. Barack Obama's dog Bo, beloved and public until he got older. His final years were largely off camera. Same with Champ, one of the Biden's dogs, who passed with barely a murmur in the news. Now, this isn't a murder mystery. No one's accusing anyone of sinister pet plots. But the pattern remains. Presidential animals arrive with fanfare. Some leave in silence. And in a building where everything is tracked. Who you see, what you eat, what tie you wear. Why aren't the pets accounted for? Maybe the answer is simple. Maybe it's messy. Or maybe it's something deeper. The first pet is an emotional prop. Once they no longer serve the image, they vanish. Quietly. Like staffers. Like scandals. Like truths. After all, in Washington, loyalty is everything. Until you stop polling well. The curious case of President Garfield's assassin, and the question of who really killed him. One man shot him, but it took 19 doctors, 3 months, and a whole lot of bad decisions to finish the job. July 2nd, 1881. President James A. Garfield walks into a Washington train station. He's not surrounded by Secret Service, because back then presidents didn't get bodyguards. The country was still under the illusion that bullets respected power. Waiting for him is Charles Guiteau, a disgruntled office seeker and self-declared prophet of divine vengeance. He pulls a pistol and fires 2 shots. One grazes Garfield's arm, the other buries itself deep in his lower back. Guiteau is arrested on the spot. He reportedly says, "I am a stalwart, and Arthur is now president," a reference to Chester A. Arthur, Garfield's vice president, and an unsubtle attempt to frame the shooting as a twisted act of political promotion. But here's the twist. Garfield didn't die that day. In fact, he lingered for 11 weeks. He lay in the White House, slowly dying, not from the bullet, but from what happened after. You see, American medicine in 1881 was still experimental. Germ theory was gaining traction, but hand washing, optional. Sterile instruments, a European luxury, and President Garfield, he became a guinea pig for every ego in a white coat. The doctors probed the wound with bare fingers. With unsterilized tools, they dug into the president's body repeatedly trying to find the bullet, guided not by x-rays, which hadn't been invented yet, but by guesswork, arrogance, and in one spectacularly misguided instance, a metal detector designed by Alexander Graham Bell. Bell's device actually worked. It picked up a metallic signal in Garfield's body, but the doctors, convinced the bullet was on the left side, only allowed Bell to scan there when it was actually on the right. So the signal was dismissed, and the bullet remained undisturbed. While infection set in, the wound festered, pus pooled, abscesses formed deep inside the president's abdomen. He developed blood poisoning, pneumonia, and a galloping systemic infection. By the time Garfield died on September 19th, 1881, his body had wasted away. The autopsy revealed the bullet had lodged harmlessly behind his pancreas. It hadn't hit anything fatal. He could have survived had they just left him alone. So here's the mystery. Who really killed President Garfield? Was it Guiteau, the unhinged gunman, or was it Dr. Willard Bliss, the arrogant lead physician who pushed aside other doctors, dismissed antiseptic methods, and essentially played a game of 19th century operation with a live human president? Guiteau, during his trial, made the argument himself. I shot him, yes, but the doctors, they murdered him. And weirdly, he kind of had a point. Guiteau was convicted anyway, executed by hanging. Justice served, or so the record says, but in the margins of the official story lies a quiet horror. The American medical establishment may have killed its own president by accident, or worse, by ego, because when men who believe they're infallible refuse to admit they're wrong, history doesn't call it malpractice. It calls it destiny. 31. The case of Grover Cleveland's secret surgery on a yacht. The press asked where the president went. The answer? 6 teeth, part of his jaw, and the truth, floating off the coast of Long Island. It's 1893. Grover Cleveland is president again. His second term, non-consecutive, the only one to do it. He's 55, portly, blunt, and trying to steer a country through the panic of 1893, a brutal financial crisis threatening to collapse the U.S. economy. Then he disappears. Not completely, not dramatically, just slips away. A 6-day cruise aboard a friend's yacht. The Oneida to clear his head, the press is told. A little summer respite. Nothing to see here, except there was something growing inside his mouth. Cleveland had noticed a rough patch on the roof of his mouth earlier that year. It didn't go away. It got bigger. Doctors examined it and diagnosed epithelioma, a potentially fatal cancer, which posed a problem, not just medical, but political. The country was on the edge of collapse. Banks were failing. Unemployment was surging. And the president? He had cancer in his face. If the public found out, it could tank already shaky confidence in the economy. It could trigger chaos. Or worse, panic. Not the economic kind, the existential kind. So Cleveland decided to lie. On June 30th, 1893, he boarded the Oneida in New York Harbor with a hand-picked surgical team, a dentist, and a plan over the course of a 90-minute procedure performed in total secrecy aboard a moving yacht. Surgeons removed 5 teeth, a portion of his upper jaw, a cancerous mass roughly the size of a golf ball. The surgery was done through the president's mouth, so there would be no visible scar. They wired part of his face with rubber prosthetics to maintain the shape of his jaw and restore speech. The boat docked days later. Cleveland reappeared. No one asked why he suddenly looked different, spoke a little differently, or had lost weight. And for a while, the lie held, until a reporter named Alicia J. Edwards, working for the Philadelphia Press, broke the story. He had sources. He had details. He had the truth. The administration denied it. Hard. They discredited Edwards, called it sensationalism, a hoax, fake news, 19th century style. It worked. The story faded for 24 years. Only in 1917, after Cleveland's death, did one of the surgeons finally confess, yes, it happened. Yes, the president had cancer. Yes, we did surgery on a yacht to make sure no one found out. The removed tumor was preserved in a jar. The prosthetic jaw, nicknamed the rubber cheek, sat in a drawer. And the American public? They had been lied to. But here's the question. Was it a lie to protect national security? Or a lie to protect political ego? Was it necessary or precedent setting? Because if a president can secretly vanish for life-saving surgery, what else can be done without telling the people? Today, the story is mostly forgotten, but the lesson is carved into the bones of presidential power. Illness is weakness, and in Washington, weakness is never disclosed. It is denied, deflected, and, in Cleveland's case, surgically removed. 32. The bizarre coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy. History doesn't repeat itself. It just gets lazy and copies the homework from a different century. You've probably heard the highlights. Lincoln and Kennedy, two American presidents, both assassinated, both martyrs in the eyes of history. But what most people don't realize is just how strangely parallel their lives and deaths appear when you start laying the facts side by side. Let's start with the basics. Abraham Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. John F. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy, 1960. Both were succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. Lyndon B. Johnson, born in 1908. Both Johnsons were Southern Democrats. Both were senators before becoming vice president. Both took office after a presidential assassination, and both were deeply unpopular during their terms. Getting uncomfortable yet? Let's keep going. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. That's not urban legend. It's been verified. And no, the secretaries didn't die in any dramatic way. But the coincidence is still enough to make your eyebrows twitch. Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater. Kennedy was shot while riding in a Lincoln, a car made by the Ford Motor Company. Both presidents were shot in the head on a Friday, seated next to their wives. Neither wife was injured. Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, who was born in 1839. Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald, born in 1939. Both assassins were known by 3 names. Both names contained 15 letters. Both men were killed before they could stand trial. And Booth ran from a theater and was caught in a warehouse. Oswald ran from a warehouse and was caught in a theater. That's where most people stop. But if you really want to lose sleep, both men pushed civil rights legislation. Both were viewed as outsiders by the political elite. Both saw their presidencies defined by deep national division. Both died in the midst of re-election campaigns. Now, historians will tell you this is all coincidence. That if you pick any 2 prominent men from history and cherry-pick enough details, you'll find patterns. It's just math. Coincidence mixed with confirmation bias. But still, why these patterns? Why these men? And why does history keep replaying the same trauma over and over, like it's trying to tell us something we still refuse to hear? Maybe it's all just an eerie accident, or maybe the American presidency is less about individuals and more about an archetype, a recurring character, a narrative myth that requires certain patterns, certain deaths, certain blood sacrifices to keep the machine moving. Or maybe we just like our martyrs symmetrical. 33. The Forgotten President. David Rice, Atchison. President for one day. He never ran for president. He never took the oath. But for one strange Sunday in 1849, the U.S. may have had a leader it didn't know existed. Let's rewind to March 4th, 1849, a Sunday. Zachary Taylor, the newly elected 12th President of the United States, was scheduled to be inaugurated that day. But Taylor, a man of old-school religious values and slightly dramatic timing, refused to take the oath of office on a Sunday. He believed it would violate the Sabbath, so he postponed his swearing-in until Monday, March 5th. Here's where things get weird. According to the U.S. Constitution, a president's term ends at noon on March 4th. That means James K. Polk's presidency legally expired, leaving a 24-hour leadership vacuum. No president, no vice president. And that's when a peculiar name enters the record, David Rice Atchison, a Missouri senator, a pro-slavery Democrat, a political hardliner known more for his aggressive stances than his charisma. Atchison happened to be the president pro tempore of the Senate at the time, a position third in line to the presidency after the vice president, who also technically ceased to exist the moment Polk's administration ended. According to succession logic, some historians and legal enthusiasts have argued Atchison was, by default, acting president for that 24-hour period. He didn't take the oath, he didn't issue any orders, he didn't move into the White House, In fact, he reportedly slept through most of the day, later joking that he'd had the most honest administration in history because he didn't do a damn thing. But constitutionally, no one's entirely sure. Some legal scholars argue that the presidency doesn't require the oath to begin, just the passage of time and electoral confirmation. If that's true, then Taylor was president the moment March 4th began, oath or not. Others argue that the absence of an oath creates a liminal space, a loophole in which someone has to be president, and in 1849 that someone might have been Atchison. Here's where the mystery deepens. There are no official documents from that day naming Atchison president. No proclamations, no presidential seal, just later recollections, newspaper blurbs, and a handful of historians who treat it as an amusing historical footnote. And yet, Atchison himself leaned into the legend. A monument on his grave even reads, President of the United States for one day. So, was he? Maybe. Maybe not. But here's the bigger question. How fragile is the office of the presidency if one day of delay turns a senator into a head of state? If a Sunday off can create a constitutional gray zone, then maybe the title President of the United States isn't about the oath, or the ceremony, or even the election. Maybe it's just about who's awake when the clock strikes noon. 34th, the Lincoln White House Séance sessions. When you lose a child in the middle of a war, reason leaves the room. And sometimes you invite something else in. By the time Abraham Lincoln moved into the White House in 1861, America was already dying, state by state, soul by soul. The Civil War had begun, and the presidency wasn't just a political job anymore. It was a vigil over a country hemorrhaging itself into history. Then the war took something from Lincoln himself. Willie Lincoln, the president's third son, died in February 1862. He was 11 years old. Typhoid fever, they said, brought on by contaminated drinking water inside the White House itself. That part, tragically, is fact. What followed? That's where things drift into mystery. Mary Todd Lincoln was shattered. By all accounts, the First Lady spiraled into a state of grief so profound that it turned spiritual. She began attending séances, first privately, then reportedly inside the White House itself. Yes, séances. In the Red Room, the Blue Room, even the East Room, where Lincoln himself would later lie in state. And Mary wasn't just dabbling. She believed. She spoke with mediums, held spirit circles, and tried to contact her dead son. One of her preferred spiritualists was Cranston Lorry, a Washington-based medium who supposedly facilitated conversations with young Willie from the beyond. Mary would describe these events in detail in letters, how Willie appeared in shining garments, how he told her not to weep, how he assured her that Papa would be joining him someday, which is a hell of a thing to hear when you're the leader of a dying nation. But what about Lincoln himself? At first, he was skeptical. He was, after all, a man of logic and law. But as the war dragged on and the personal losses piled up, something changed. He began attending the séances, quietly, occasionally, sometimes just standing in the corner, sometimes participating. There are accounts from mediums, from staff, even from reporters, that describe Lincoln as somber, curious, and deeply affected. One séance allegedly involved a table levitating several inches into the air while Lincoln sat nearby. He made no public comment about it, but he came back more than once. Some say he was just humoring Mary. Others believe he was searching for something he couldn't get from his generals, or his cabinet, or even the Bible. Closure, or maybe answers. Because Lincoln's own writings during this period grow darker. His speeches filled with fate, destiny, and cosmic judgment. The Emancipation Proclamation reads almost like an exorcism. His letters to friends and aides are laced with metaphysical dread, and some historians believe the seances weren't just about Willie, they were about America, about communing with the dead who were being created by the thousands every month. If your presidency becomes a war memorial in real time, do you not start looking for ghosts? The sessions eventually ended, or were silenced. Mary never stopped believing. Lincoln, if he believed, never said. But after his assassination, she returned to the séance circuit, desperate to speak to her husband the way she once did her son. Some say she succeeded. But if Lincoln's spirit ever did return, he hasn't left, at least according to every ghost story that still walks the White House halls. 35. the missing FBI file on Martin Luther King Jr. and Lyndon B. Johnson. If a file is missing from the FBI's archives, ask yourself this: was it ever lost? Or did someone make sure it wouldn't be found? By 1964, two American titans were reshaping the nation. Lyndon B. Johnson, who inherited the presidency in the aftermath of an assassin's bullet, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was dragging the moral arc of the universe toward justice one march at a time. Publicly, they were allies. Awkward ones, but allies nonetheless. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. King stood beside him, the image of progress incarnate. But behind the scenes, a different story. Because while Johnson was pushing civil rights legislation, his government, his FBI, led by the ever-shadowy J. Edgar Hoover, was actively surveilling, harassing, and attempting to destroy Martin Luther King Jr. The FBI had placed King under intense surveillance since the late 1950s. Taps on phones, bugs in hotel rooms, agents embedded near his circle, entire departments dedicated to discrediting him, recording him, and eventually blackmailing him. It was known internally as COINTELPRO, the Counterintelligence Program. Officially, it was about monitoring subversive elements. In practice, it was a state-sponsored psychological operation against civil rights leaders. Now, here's where the mystery sharpens. A specific FBI file, rumored to document correspondence, tapes, transcripts, and intelligence briefings between the FBI and the Johnson White House regarding King, has vanished, gone, not declassified, not redacted, not missing a few pages, gone entirely. Researchers, journalists, and FOIA requesters have spent decades trying to track it down. Some say it was part of a batch of sensitive materials that Johnson ordered sealed before leaving office. Others claim Hoover had it destroyed, along with a trove of illegal surveillance records that could have ruined both his legacy and Johnson's. And then there's the truly chilling possibility that the file never existed as a formal record, that it was kept off the books, passed hand to hand, memorized, then burned. In Washington, this is known as plausible deniability's best friend. We know something was there. Fragments remain. References to memos that don't exist. Citations with no sources. Gaps in timelines that don't make sense. One missing document allegedly described King as a national security threat. Another may have recorded a meeting where Johnson was briefed on illegal surveillance and approved of it. We don't know what Johnson knew, or when, or how much he sanctioned. But here's what we do know. The FBI sent King an anonymous letter, encouraging him to kill himself. They mailed tapes of his alleged infidelities to his wife. They tried to push him off the public stage, not because he was violent, but because he was persuasive. And if the president knew, if he watched it happen, then the missing file isn't just a bureaucratic blip. It's a smoking gun that never made it to the evidence locker. 36. The disappearance of the burn bag from the Clinton White House. In Washington, secrets don't always leak. Sometimes they just walk out the door in a fireproof pouch. The White House handles more secrets per day than most nations do in a year. National security briefings, intelligence memos, classified cables, private conversations with nuclear implications. So, what do you do with that paperwork when it's no longer needed? You don't recycle it. You don't shred it. You burn it. Enter the burn bag, a thick, fire-resistant envelope marked for destruction. These bags are used throughout the U.S. government to dispose of sensitive materials. Once full, they're sealed, logged, and sent off to incineration sites or high-security shredders. They're not supposed to go missing, but during the Clinton administration, one of them did. The exact date remains murky. Some say 1996. Others point to early 1997. Either way, the story broke quietly. Tucked in the back pages of national security briefings, a single burn bag, reportedly filled with highly sensitive contents from the National Security Council, vanished inside the White House complex. Not misplaced, not delayed, gone. The bag was never logged as destroyed. The contents were never cataloged, and whatever was inside it, to this day, no one will say. What was in it? That's the question no one wants to answer. But the timing was interesting. This was the period of the Bosnia conflict, Middle East peace talks, and burgeoning cyber warfare operations. Some believe the bag may have included internal memos about U.S. military posture in Eastern Europe. Others think it contained documents about domestic surveillance experiments being quietly authorized by the Clinton administration post-Oklahoma City bombing. And then there's the wild card, foreign intelligence sources. Some have speculated, quietly, carefully, that the bag may have contained names, human assets, people working for the U.S. in unfriendly places. Which means this wasn't just a breach. It may have been an exposure. The official response? Shrug. Internal memos claimed it was likely incinerated without proper documentation. Translation: we don't know what happened to it, but we'd really like to stop talking about it now. But the Secret Service was less convinced. So was the NSA. An informal audit was conducted. Multiple staffers were interviewed. No culprit, no whistleblower, no confession. The bag had entered the system, then the system swallowed it, or someone took it. Because here's the unspoken reality. A burn bag is the perfect delivery mechanism for state secrets. Portable, untraceable, and if no one knows what's inside it, there's no paper trail to follow. Just heat and silence. So did a staffer screw up? Did a foreign agent get lucky? Or did someone in the administration want that bag gone? We'll never know. And that's the point. Because when secrets are burned, the truth dies with them. But when they go missing, that's when the paranoia begins. 37, the mysterious whispering gallery in the U.S. Capitol, and the secrets it's heard. In a city built on eavesdropping, there's one room where the building itself listens. Welcome to the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. It's where history is painted on the ceiling, where presidents lie in state, where school groups shuffle past statues while senators plot revolutions in $4,000 suits. But if you stand in just the right spot, you'll notice something strange. Whispers carry loudly, accurately, across impossible distances. This is what's called a whispering gallery, an architectural quirk found in perfectly domed spaces. The way sound bounces along the curved ceiling allows a whisper spoken against the wall to be heard clearly on the opposite side of the dome. It's a rare, eerie acoustic phenomenon. Most visitors chalk it up to design. A fluke. A neat trick. But in Washington, there's no such thing as a harmless echo. For decades, rumors have swirled around the whispering properties of the Capitol Dome, not just the physical ones, but the political ones. Because if a whisper can travel that far without raising a voice, then maybe the room wasn't designed for grandeur. Maybe it was designed for surveillance. During the 19th century, some lawmakers refused to hold private conversations inside the rotunda, even when alone. There were stories of phrases repeated back to them days later, word for word, of aides overhearing discussions they weren't invited to, of secrets somehow not staying secret. And it gets stranger. During the Cold War, Capitol staffers reported phantom echoes, words and fragments of conversations that seemed to come from nowhere. One janitor claimed he heard voices arguing over Cuba hours after the room had emptied. He wasn't believed. Until a week later, when the exact argument he described appeared in the congressional record, word for word. Was it a ghost, a trick of the acoustics, or something recorded? Some theorists claim the gallery may have been retrofitted at some point for acoustic surveillance, that intelligence agencies, obsessed with congressional chatter, found a way to exploit the dome's natural properties to capture high-level discussions without bugs, wires, or devices. Others say it never needed retrofitting. The building itself is the bug, and some, architects mostly, insist that the gallery is just a novelty, a curiosity, a harmless trick of shape and sound. But if it's harmless, why do certain senators still refuse to speak inside the dome without white noise machines running nearby? Why are sensitive committee meetings held anywhere else? And why, to this day, does no one stand with their back to the wall in the rotunda and speak above a whisper? Because in Washington, the only thing more dangerous than being heard is thinking you're not. 38. The vanishing presidential portrait of George Washington. Stolen or hidden. They saved one portrait from the fire, but another one vanished into smoke, and no one's ever seen it again. When the British torched Washington, D.C. in 1814, the White House burned. So did much of the Library of Congress, the Capitol, and the physical nerve center of a still young republic. One story survived the flames. Literally, Dolly Madison, the First Lady, famously rescued the full-length portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart from the White House before fleeing. That painting, now known as the Lansdowne Portrait, remains one of the most famous images in American history. But here's what most people don't know: it wasn't the only one. According to archival records, another portrait of George Washington, also believed to be painted by Stuart, or possibly by one of his protégés, was hanging elsewhere in the White House during the same period. This second painting was smaller, possibly more experimental, and never seen again after the fire. Some say it was destroyed, others say it was stolen, and the mystery begins there. A 19th century inventory of White House art, completed shortly before the British invasion, lists an unnamed Washington portrait hanging near a second-floor study. No surviving sketches, no known duplicates, just a line item in a logbook. After the fire, that logbook became the only trace of its existence. No one knows what the painting looked like. No detailed description, just speculation. Some art historians believe it may have been an earlier version of Washington seated, rather than standing. Others think it was an unfinished portrait, never meant for display, a work in progress that wound up displayed anyway, because hey, it was Washington. But here's the strange part. In the decades following the fire, multiple private collectors claimed to own a mystery Washington portrait with uncertain provenance. No signatures, no titles, but striking likenesses. Some even matched Stuart's style, brushstroke for brushstroke. None were verified. One surfaced in London in the 1870s, then disappeared. Another was seen in a Massachusetts estate sale in 1912, but the buyer's name was never released. One even reportedly turned up in Argentina in the 1950s, hanging in a diplomat's private office. Each time, experts tried to trace the painting's origins. Each time, the trail went cold. So, what happened to the lost Washington? Did a British officer pocket it during the sacking of the White House? Did a staffer rescue it and quietly keep it? Did it burn and the logbook entry is just the ghost of something that's now ash? Or, and this is the theory that sticks in certain paranoid circles, was it hidden intentionally? Because some believe the painting showed a version of Washington the government didn't want remembered. A softer Washington, a brooding Washington, a version stripped of the grandeur and myth, painted in a moment of doubt or pain, too real, too fragile, too human. And if that's true, then its disappearance isn't just a loss to art history. It's an act of image control, because a country that needed marble men didn't want portraits with eyes that begged for rest. So maybe it's still out there, in a vault, a private gallery, or hanging silently above a mantle in a house where no one knows what they have. And maybe, just maybe, it's watching us the way Washington always does, only this time from a frame we forgot existed. 39. The secret resignation letter of Richard Nixon, the one he never used. The pen was ready, the wording was drafted, the moment passed, and history marched on with a man who probably should have left sooner. We all remember the big resignation. August 8th, 1974. Richard Nixon appears on live television, sweaty and stoic, and announces he will resign the presidency. Watergate had finally cornered him. His allies had peeled away. The tapes, the ones with the 18.5-minute gap, had spoken louder than any press conference. But what most people don't know is that this wasn't the first time Nixon had a resignation letter ready. It wasn't even the second. According to aides, Nixon had at least 2 earlier drafts of resignation letters written and prepared long before his actual departure. One of them, reportedly typed in late 1973, was said to be complete, signed, dated, and ready for delivery. And then he didn't use it. The letter was drafted in the wake of the Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox and watched his Attorney General and Deputy AG resign in protest. It was a constitutional firebomb. That night, Nixon was rattled. He reportedly told aides he felt trapped, that his presidency was unsustainable. In a rare flash of self-awareness, he admitted he might not survive the storm. So the letter was drafted. A simple resignation, effective immediately. No speeches, no moral justification, just a clean legal break. It was never submitted. Instead, Nixon slept on it. By morning, the resolve was gone. The letter was pulled. Aides were told to forget it. And the president, once again, leaned into the lie he told himself best. I can still win. The existence of this phantom resignation letter was confirmed years later by multiple sources: former White House counsel John Dean, journalist Bob Woodward, And even Nixon's own post-resignation memoir dances around the moment without naming it. But the letter itself? Still missing. No copy was ever included in the Nixon Presidential Library. It was never archived in official documents. No scanned image, no typed transcript, just an empty space in the record where history almost turned early. And that's the mystery. Where did it go? Some say Nixon had it destroyed out of pride. Others believe it was quietly filed away in one of the classified document boxes that vanished during the chaotic final weeks of his presidency. There's even a rumor that one of Nixon's aides kept it as a souvenir, a paper guillotine that never dropped, a warning in a desk drawer. And here's the haunting part. If Nixon had resigned earlier, before the worst of Watergate unraveled, he might have salvaged his legacy, saved face, spared the country months of turmoil, avoided becoming the cautionary tale that still echoes today. But he didn't. He hesitated, stalled, waited until the truth was undeniable, until resignation was the only option, not a choice. So the letter remains a ghost, a what if in presidential history. And maybe that's what makes it so terrifying. Not because it was lost, but because he could have used it and chose not to. 40. The missing presidential inauguration Bible pages. They swear to defend the Constitution with one hand on the Bible, but no one asks what happens to the Bible after the cameras stop rolling. The presidential oath of office is one of the most solemn rituals in American political theater. Right hand raised, left hand on a Bible, sometimes family, sometimes historic. The words are familiar, memorized, televised, eternal, but the object under that hand, that's where the mystery begins, because several inaugural Bibles, or at least the ones presented as such, have been discovered to be missing pages. Torn, removed, altered, sometimes just gone, sometimes replaced, sometimes blank. Let's start with the famous one, the Lincoln Bible. Used at Abraham Lincoln's first inauguration in 1861, the book itself was a last-minute choice. It wasn't even his. The Chief Justice forgot to bring a Bible, so a clerk ran to retrieve a standard edition used for oaths of office. It was supposed to be returned to storage, but over the years, it became a symbolic relic, displayed, replicated, used again by Barack Obama, revered, except several pages are missing. Not torn out violently, not burned, just gone, lifted, removed. No record of when or by whom. The missing pages, reportedly from the Book of Psalms and the Epistles of Paul, two areas often cited during moral appeals to unity, justice, and divine law. So, who took them? No one knows. Then there's George Washington's inaugural Bible, the one borrowed from St. John's Lodge No. 1. A Masonic chapter in New York, a leather-bound King James edition with deep symbolic resonance. Washington opened it randomly to Genesis 49. Or so the story goes. But here's the twist. When historians examined that Bible decades later, there were signs of tampering. Pages folded. One corner missing. A tiny hole burned through the page that Washington allegedly touched. Some believed it was damage from wear. Others thought it was intentional. A souvenir, or worse, a signal. And it gets even stranger. In at least 3 other inaugurations, James Buchanan, 1857, Rutherford B. Hayes, 1877, and Calvin Coolidge, 1925, the official Bibles were later found to be incomplete. In Buchanan's case, the Bible used couldn't be found at all just 10 years after the ceremony. Hayes's was missing its flyleaf and several pages from Leviticus. Coolidge's had an entire chapter excised, later recovered from a private collector's estate sale. Let that sink in. Pieces of sacred books used to swear in the most powerful man on earth ended up on someone's mantle. So, why do these pages keep disappearing? Souvenirs? Political relics for collectors? Sure, that's the simple answer. But some conspiracy theorists go further. They suggest certain verses were deliberately removed to erase the symbolism, to twist the oath, to rewrite the image of what was sworn to. Psalm 72, for instance, speaks of a king who delivers the needy and crushes the oppressor, gone from Lincoln's structure of his statue. 1 Corinthians 13 on love, truth, endurance, rumored to be missing from the Coolidge Bible. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a city where symbols matter more than facts, and optics outweigh oaths, maybe the Bible isn't just a prop. Maybe it's a contract, and if pages go missing from a contract, what happens to the power it's supposed to bless? 41. The unexplained emergency broadcast during Reagan's presidency. At 2:33 a.m., Every channel in America said the world might end. Then it said nothing at all. The Emergency Broadcast System, EBS, was created during the Cold War to do one thing: alert the American public in the event of nuclear war, natural disaster, or total governmental collapse. Every TV, every radio, every tower connected to the same central switch. One button, one voice, one message. It had never been used for a real national emergency until it was. Sort of. February 20th, 1971, a full decade before the event we're discussing, and worth mentioning first. On that day, the EBS accidentally issued a national alert by mistake. Panic ensued. No retraction came for 40 minutes, but that incident had an explanation: operator error. Fast forward to 1985, during the height of the Reagan administration. The Cold War is frigid. Reagan's on TV warning about evil empires. The world is one itchy trigger finger away from flashing white. And then, sometime in early March, around 2:30 a.m., TVs across multiple states, California, Oregon, Washington, and even parts of the Midwest are suddenly interrupted. A loud tone, static. Then, this is an emergency action notification. This is not a test. The chilling phrase that had only ever been used in drills, now live. No context, no reason, just the tone, the words, and a screen that slowly faded to black. Then, silence. No follow-up, no all clear, no explanation. The system went dark for approximately 15 minutes. When it returned, programming resumed as normal. Cartoons, static, midnight weather girls with too much hairspray. Nothing acknowledged the interruption. By the next morning, no official record existed. No FCC press release. No military statement, nothing in the newspapers, no mention from the White House, and no one took responsibility. Some local broadcasters insisted it had been a regional test gone wrong. Others were told, privately, that it had been a drill that shouldn't have reached public airwaves, but none of the official logs matched the reported broadcast, and no transcript has ever surfaced. And here's the kicker: Reagan had recently survived an assassination attempt. The government was actively updating its continuity of government protocols. The underground bunkers, the succession plans, the nuclear football. Some believe the 1985 EBS activation wasn't an accident. They say it was a live alert, triggered by an intelligence report that misinterpreted Soviet movements in the Arctic as a possible launch. In other words, the system did what it was supposed to. It warned us, and then someone called it off, but the evidence is gone. No tapes, no memos, just hundreds of eyewitness reports, a few scribbled notes from late-night radio hosts, and a permanent scar on the credibility of America's in case of apocalypse warning bell. So, what happened? A glitch? A drill? A false alarm during a real moment of panic? Or was it something else? A test run for what it looks like when the government tells you everything and nothing at once. Because in America, when the sirens scream with no follow-up, that's not a warning. That's a confession. Let's time jump. 42. The case of the president and the alleged time traveler, John Titor. He said he came from 2036. He said America had already collapsed. He said one U.S. president had the chance to stop it and didn't. In November 2000, a user appeared on an obscure online forum with the handle Time Travel Zero. The posts were strange, calm, technical. The man claimed to be a soldier from the year 2036, part of a U.S. military time travel program based in Tampa, Florida. His mission: travel to the year 1975 and retrieve an IBM 5100 computer, a now obsolete machine with a unique and little-known ability to emulate older systems critical for debugging in his future. But due to the nature of time travel, according to him, he stopped in 2000 to rest, to observe, and to warn. Eventually, he gave himself a name: John Titor. His posts spread across forums like Time Travel Institute and Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM community, included photos of the alleged time machine installed in a 1987 Chevy Suburban, complete with parts lists, operational instructions, and quantum mechanics jargon that sounded plausible enough to scare physicists and amuse the Pentagon. But Titor didn't just talk tech. He made predictions. civil unrest in America starting in 2004, a second civil war dividing the U.S. into 5 regional zones, nuclear war in 2015, involving Russia and major U.S. cities, a drastically altered constitution, the fall of centralized government, a rural survivalist America rising from the ashes. He described a bleak, fragmented future that somehow felt like a fever dream and a warning shot. Most of it didn't come true, at least not in the linear way we expected, but some details stuck, especially one claim that a sitting U.S. president in the early 2000s was briefed about the possibility of a time-traveling visitor and was given a classified report detailing Teeter's arrival and mission. He never named the president outright, but the timeline points to George W. Bush. According to Titer, the administration was shown predictive models generated using data he left behind. Government officials, he said, were more interested in weaponizing the concepts than preventing the societal collapse he described. And perhaps the strangest part, a real 1975 IBM 5100 was found to possess undocumented functionality. Specifically, the ability to emulate older mainframe code, exactly as Titer claimed. This capability wasn't publicly known at the time. Only a few IBM engineers were aware of it. How did an internet troll know this in 2000? And why did government agencies, including the Department of Defense and NSA, quietly scrub references to the forums where Titer originally posted? Today, the original Titer threads are fragmented, archived, redacted. There's no official investigation, of course, just unofficial curiosity. But in 2009, a Freedom of Information Act request was filed to inquire about Titer and possible time travel-related briefings delivered to the executive branch between 1999 to 2004. The response: "We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of such records." Classic. So was John Titer a hoax? A viral LARP before viral LARPs were a thing? Or was he what he claimed to be? A man from the future who saw the signs, warned us, and was ignored? Because if he was real, and if a US president did know, and chose silence, then the strangest thing about this story isn't the time machine. It's that someone in power might have believed him. 43. The lost pages of Theodore Roosevelt's Amazon diary. The jungle tried to kill him. The diary tried to explain why. But some of it disappeared. In 1913, Theodore Roosevelt, former president, bull moose, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and human stick of dynamite, did something that, even by his standards, was insane. He went to the Amazon, not for a vacation, not for diplomacy, for a scientific expedition to map an uncharted river called the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt, a snake-infested, death-haunted, malaria-ridden vein of hell that ran through the darkest parts of Brazil's rainforests. Why? Part exploration, part ego, and part post-presidential existential crisis. Roosevelt was fresh off a humiliating political loss in the 1912 election. He was angry, restless, and increasingly obsessed with proving he was still alive, still relevant. So he joined Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon, along with a team of naturalists, porters, and his own son, Kermit Roosevelt, to navigate the unknown. The trip was a disaster. They were undersupplied. They lost boats. They lost food. They lost men. One porter murdered another and then fled into the jungle, never to be seen again. Another drowned, most contracted diseases. And Roosevelt himself nearly died from an infected leg wound that left him delirious for days, begging to be left behind so he wouldn't slow the group down. He wrote all of it down. Every day, Roosevelt documented the expedition in a leather-bound diary, equal parts field notes, survival log, and confession. And when he returned, the world watched him stumble off the boat in 1914. A walking skeleton, he was never the same. He had recurring fevers, hallucinations, and heart problems until his death 5 years later. But here's where the mystery unfolds. Several pages from the diary are missing. Gone. Ripped out. Never published. Never archived. The surviving parts, eventually edited into a book titled Through the Brazilian Wilderness, are vivid, harrowing, and surprisingly candid, but they are also carefully curated. We know this because Roosevelt refers to entries that no longer exist, days that were too painful to record or too disturbing for public release, mentions of events that don't appear in the official published version. Some believe the pages were lost during the journey, washed away in the rain, destroyed in one of many capsized canoes. Others believe they were removed after the fact, perhaps by Roosevelt himself, perhaps by his son Kermit, or perhaps by someone in the Roosevelt estate, out of concern for how their contents might damage the myth of Teddy the Indestructible. But then there's the darker theory, that Roosevelt saw something out there, something not meant to be written down. Whispers from native tribes hinted at forest spirits that haunted the river, strange lights, disappearances, a part of the jungle so untouched, so wild, that even the animals behaved like they were being watched. Roosevelt didn't believe in ghosts, but when he returned, he stopped talking about what he saw in the deeper days of the expedition. He did, however, write this: "The ordinary traveler does not pass that way, and those who do seldom return unchanged." So what was in the missing pages? Hallucinations? Murders? Madness? Or something else? We'll never know, because the jungle took something from Roosevelt, and in return, he left a blank space in his own story. Let's decode it. 44. The hidden code in Ronald Reagan's final letter to America. Some goodbyes are just goodbyes. Others are messages slipped through the cracks of memory, before memory itself slips away. On November 5th, 1994, former President Ronald Reagan released a handwritten letter to the American people. It was short, gentle, heartbreaking. It announced his diagnosis with Alzheimer's disease. The letter was only 269 words, but it hit the country like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Reagan, the great communicator, the man who made America feel like it had a favorite uncle in the White House, was saying goodbye. Slowly, publicly, he ended the letter with, "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America there will always be a bright dawn ahead." Poetic, hopeful, classic Reagan. But here's the thing. In the years since its publication, cryptographers, Reagan biographers, and even some members of his former communication staff have noticed something strange about the letter. The phrasing, the rhythm, the placement of certain words, almost too perfect. In 2004, a retired NSA linguist, whose name was never officially released, claimed that the letter appeared to follow a basic transposition cipher pattern, that if you broke it into lines of a certain length, a secondary message could be teased out. Was it intentional or just an accident of elegant writing? Let's get more specific. The linguist's analysis claimed that every fifth word in the letter, when pulled out and read in order, appeared to form a fragmented secondary sentence. Something about faith, guides, nation, legacy, and, curiously, remember. Nothing concrete, but enough to raise eyebrows. Then there's the structure of the letter. The opening paragraph mirrors the conclusion almost perfectly in syllabic balance. The second paragraph contains exactly 44 words. Reagan was the 40th president, but some have speculated he was referencing his successor or successors. There's also the use of repetition. Thank you, Nancy, America, journey. Words that, to some, feel like anchors in a larger pattern. More compelling, an anonymous Reagan speechwriter, speaking under condition of strict anonymity, once hinted that the letter's final draft may have been reviewed by more people than necessary. One version of the rumor claims Nancy Reagan herself requested the letter include something special for the future. What does that mean? No one knows. There's never been an official acknowledgement of a code, and most Reagan scholars dismiss the idea as speculative at best. But this was a man whose public image was meticulously constructed, whose speeches were workshopped down to the syllable, and who once said, "The most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" So maybe the most haunting words he ever wrote were the ones he didn't say aloud. A code? A message? A final act of memory from a man about to lose his own? We don't know. But if Reagan did leave us something hidden, something layered beneath the warmth and the sunset metaphors, then somewhere in that letter, even now, he's still speaking. We just haven't figured out how to listen. 45. The unexplained artifact in the Oval Office wall. The most watched room in the world has secrets behind the drywall, and one of them, an object with no origin, still hasn't been explained. In 1995, during a minor renovation of the Oval Office, a maintenance crew working late at night noticed something odd behind a wooden panel on the southwest wall, just beneath the windows. A hollow sound, a slight gap, a panel that didn't quite match the others, older perhaps or warped. They pried it open. Behind the wood and insulation, embedded within a shallow cavity in the plaster, was an object, wrapped in cloth, dusty, carefully placed, not discarded. Inside the cloth, a small carved wooden totem. No taller than 6 inches, a humanoid figure, grotesque, stylized, smiling with teeth too many and hands pressed together in an unfamiliar gesture. Not Native American, not African, not Asian, unclassifiable, no tag, no date, no initials, just the weight of intentionality. White House historians were called in. Conservators examined the piece. It was photographed, measured, X-rayed. But here's where it gets eerie. No one knew where it came from. It didn't match any known decorative scheme. It wasn't part of any documented art installation. It appeared in no inventory from any administration. Not Roosevelt's, not Eisenhower's, not even Nixon's, who was known to keep private trinkets and totems tucked into drawers and bookcases. And then it vanished again. Shortly after discovery, the totem was removed by what one source described as a small team from the office of the curator. The item was never displayed, never included in public exhibits, never entered into the Smithsonian or White House archives. Journalists who inquired were given vague answers. Undocumented artifact, not relevant, possibly personal. No photo has ever been publicly released. A single sketch, based on the recollection of a staffer, circulated briefly online in the late 2000s before being scrubbed. It depicted the figure with 3 eyes and no feet. So where did it come from? Some believe it was a good luck charm left by a previous president, though none ever admitted to it. Others think it was smuggled in by a staffer or visitor. One unverified theory claims it's an apotropaic object, a symbol meant to ward off evil, hidden intentionally, buried like a spell. But the strangest theory? That it was placed there before the Oval Office even existed. The current Oval Office dates back to 1934, when FDR had it rebuilt. But what if the object was embedded in the structure before that, transferred from the Old West Wing, or even the original White House itself? If that's true, the totem predates modern administrations, maybe even predates the presidency, a relic of something older, something that was always watching, and now it's gone again, sealed in a vault, or lost, or returned. So the Oval Office remains, polished, pristine, and utterly silent. But behind the symmetry and symbolism, there was something once, tucked behind a wall, smiling quietly. And whatever it meant, the room still echoes with it, because when the most powerful people in the world sit in the same chair, year after year, decade after decade, something watches them back. That's it. 45 presidential mysteries, 2 hours of secrets, symbols, and strange silences. We began in plain sight. We end in hidden walls. And in between, a country built on unresolved stories. Because power doesn't just shape history, it haunts it.